Imagine you're on top of the world as a badass MMA fighter, undefeated in every fight that you step in. People everywhere worship the ground you walk on, calling you the strongest human alive at just 27 years old. But the moment you decide to retire and live a peaceful and wealthy life, a truck-kun appears out of blue and gives you a smooth kiss, sending you directly to afterlife. However, that's not even the craziest part, as next you wake up in a same body but in a whole new realm where you're stripped of your glory and forced to work as a slave every day, or else you ended up dead by goblins. The story is about a 27-year-old virgin boy named Choi Hyun-seok, who couldn't help but cry over how easily he died just when he was finally about to enjoy life. The worst part? He had never dated a girl in his entire life, and now he wouldn't get the chance to ever. However, it only took him half an hour to realize that maybe being dead wasn't so bad after all, as he had no family, no friends, no one who cared about him. On top of that, he no longer had to deal with daily exhausting training. Just as he was wallowing in those thoughts, the space in front of him started glowing, catching his attention. Suddenly, a hand reached out from the light, and then a cute angel appeared. She called him by some fancy name, SSS rank hero, and apologized for being late. She introduced herself as Rachel, a headhunter who scouts people whose lives ended on Earth. Choi Hyun-seok was completely captivated by her breathtaking beauty and couldn't focus on anything she was saying. Then, out of nowhere, the angel grabbed his hand and told him she was giving him two options. The first one was to accept his fate and wait to be reincarnated into his next life as a pitiful old bachelor. The second option? To be resurrected in another world as a famous hero that every girl dreams of spending a night with him. However, the boy didn't rush to choose between two options. Instead, he awkwardly asked Rachel if she could give him a little more time to think it through. The angel stepped closer and tried to convince Choi Hyun-seok that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, offering everything a man could ever dream of. She told him he shouldn't let it slip away so easily. But the thought of having to fight again this time, not just as a fighter but as a hero, was the reason that making him to hesitate, as all he really wanted was a peaceful life, something he had always longed for. Rachel, however, wasn't the type to give up so easily, and for some unknown reason was consisting the boy to accept her gentle offer without delay. Determined, she tried to explain things differently to help him lean toward choosing the life of a hero. This time, she used a doll to act out a scenario. As soon as Choi reincarnated as a hero, he would meet a village chief who would assign him simple, easy quests, not anything difficult or dangerous. And once he completed the tasks, the chief would reward him with his only daughter, who also happened to be the most beautiful girl on the entire continent. Even after seeing this little demonstration, though, the boy looked even more confused. He didn't seem any closer to making a decision and showed no signs of leaning toward the hero life. Seeing Choi's expression, Rachel quickly realized her first plan had completely failed. Without missing a beat, she moved on to her backup plan. Suddenly, the angel turned around and started to walk away, making it clear she was disappointed in the boy. She wished him good luck living as a pitiful old bachelor and casually reminded him that there was no guarantee he'd even reincarnate as a human in his next life. Her plan worked perfectly after all. The last thing Choi Hyun-seok wanted was to come back as some ugly bachelor animal in his next life. Panicking, he jumped into action, grabbed Rachel's feet, and started begging, saying he'd do whatever she wanted. At first, the angel pretended not to hear him, asking him to repeat what he just said. This time, Choi, still clinging tightly to her feet, shouted at the top of his lungs that he'd become the hero. A satisfied smile spread across Rachel's face as her second plan had worked like a charm. Without wasting any time, Angel Rachel got straight to work, preparing to send the boy to his new life, something he wasn't expecting to happen so quickly. As a glowing teleportation circle appeared beneath him, Rachel cheerfully announced that there was no point in wasting time here when a wonderful new world was waiting for him. The thought of being sent to another world without any proper preparation was terrifying for him. But his complaints fell on deaf ears as the angel sent him off without giving him a chance to voice his concerns. Once her job was done, Rachel's mood completely shifted. She was all smiles, feeling relieved after spending so much of her time convincing Choi Hyun-seok to do what she wanted. But just as she was about to relax, she got a call from someone. She quickly reported that Choi Hyun-seok's transmigration was successfully completed as promised, and then casually asked for her commission as per their deal. Moments later, the protagonist found himself lying on a wooden bed, half asleep and hearing or maybe dreaming about someone trying to wake him up. He figured it must be the village chief that Rachel had mentioned, here to give him the easy tasks she described. Feeling confident about what was coming, Choi Hyun-seok thought it would be a piece of cake to handle. However, his peaceful moment was brutally interrupted when a heavy blow struck his stomach. He shot up from the bed in an irritated mood, ready to confront whoever dared to wake him up in such a manner. But the sight that greeted him left him completely stunned. A massive orc stood in front of him, wearing a bull's skull on its head, shouting furiously about how he dared to sleep in the slave dormitory at this hour of the day. For a moment, the protagonist thought this must really be the village chief, the one who was supposed to offer him his daughter after completing simple quests. So, he respectfully sat on the bed and introduced himself as the hero without mentioning his real name. The orc stepped closer, looked him up and down, and then, to Choi's surprise, muttered, "Are heroes these days really this stupid?" Choi Hyun-seok blinked in confusion, wondering if he'd somehow done something wrong. This guy didn't seem like the kind and welcoming village chief Rachel had described, Still, he convinced himself that a sweet and beautiful angel like Rachel wouldn't lie to him for no reason. He realized this must be some kind of test, a challenge or maybe a tutorial quest to kickstart his journey in this new world. But the aura radiating from the bull-headed orc sent chills down his spine. It was overwhelming, and for a moment, he hesitated. Still, as a former professional Korean fighter, Choi decided he couldn't back down now. Fear or not, he had to face this head-on. All of a sudden, he sprang into action, aiming a kick straight for the orc's weak spot. Confident he could take out this flimsy tutorial monster with nothing but a swift kick, he gave it his all. His foot struck its target dead on, but to his shock, the blow barely phased the red orc. The creature didn't even stumble, it just stood there, looking more annoyed than anything else. The situation took a turn when the monster grabbed the boy's leg midair, mocking him, questioning how a so-called hero could be such a weakling. The creature started squeezing the boy's leg angrily, muttering to himself about how tired he was of dealing with foolish humans like this. The boy immediately felt sharp pain in his leg, but things went from bad to worse when the cow-headed orc prepared to strike back, snarling about teaching the self-proclaimed hero a lesson. Choi could sense the danger, but he was in no condition to dodge or block the attack. Hours later, Choi Hanseok woke up in an underground prison, thrashing around and shouting for a rematch with the cow-headed orc. His desperate cries echoed through the cell until the door suddenly creaked open. This time, a goblin entered, carrying a massive blood-stained sword on his shoulder. The goblin glared at him and growled, "Why have you been such a pain in the ass lately?" The sight of the goblin and his sword scared the life out of Choi, who instantly promised to stay quiet from now on. Before leaving, the goblin warned him, "If you pull something like this again, I'll turn you into meat soup," leaving the terrified boy alone with his thoughts. Once again, the boy found himself drowning in thoughts about how he ended up here, feeling nothing like the hero the angel had claimed he would be. The fact that he might die again as a virgin was only making his mood worse. Suddenly, a voice from a small window called out to him, snapping him out of his thoughts. Choi Hae-seok couldn't help but wonder who was on the other side. The voice introduced himself as a senior who was about to become a hero soon. The guy went on to reveal that they were being held in the Demon King's army fortress, a place where humans were enslaved. Recognizing the man's accent, Choi immediately realized he was Korean and eagerly asked if he knew why they had been imprisoned there. Seeing how curious the boy was, the man started shouting loudly, "Hey, self-proclaimed heroes, are you still alive? The real hero who's come to save us is finally here." It turned out the two of them weren't the only ones locked in that prison, as others began shouting for help too, each one claiming to be a hero. This only made Choi feel even more confused. Sensing this, the man decided to explain everything he knew to the bewildered newcomer. According to the guy, the one in charge of this place is the orc with a bull skull on his head, known as Riedrun. The goblins, like the one Choi Hanseok encountered earlier, are the prison guards here. But what he said next about Rachel completely shocked Choi. He claimed that all of them ended up here because of her. Calling her a wicked demon, the guy doubted whether she had sent them here on purpose or if it was some kind of mistake. Hearing this, Choi couldn't help but ponder if he wasn't supposed to be there. He decided to double-check if the guy's information was legit. The man confidently reassured him, saying he had pieced everything together from the other so-called heroes locked up in different areas of the fortress. According to his findings, heroes usually start their journey in the middle of bustling cities or quiet rural villages. That's how it's supposed to happen, but in their case, it seemed Angel Rachel had tricked them and sent them to the wrong place entirely. In just a few seconds, it all started to sink in. Choi was convinced he was about to live a miserable, harsh life in this place, all because he fell for that cute angel's sweet words. Worse yet, he was probably going to die as a virgin again. Hours later, the scene shifted to another part of the fortress where goblin soldiers were guarding a group of slaves hard at work. Among them was Choi Hae-seok, who was being forced to carry a massive tree trunk on his shoulder while begrudgingly singing the work song, "Let's crush the humans. Let's devour the humans." Every word of that song made his blood boil. Just then, the goblin on top of tree loudly announced that their work for the day was done, and they were dismissed for today. Barely containing his anger, Choi clenched his fists and silently promised himself, "One day, I'll tear that goblin limb from limb." Exhausted and seething, he returned to his cell and lay down, trying to catch his breath. As he stared at the cold, damp walls of the prison, he couldn't help but think, honestly, staying in this freezing cell is way better than working in that godforsaken yard as a slave. Suddenly, a memory of Rachel flashed in his mind. He recalled the moment she mentioned that, as a hero in another world, he would be able to see his status in a specific window. At first, Choi scoffed at the idea, thinking it was probably just another one of her lies. But after some thought, he decided to give it a try. Gathering his courage, he uttered the words, "status window," feeling a little ridiculous. To his shock, something actually happened. In an instant, a glowing window appeared in front of him, displaying his abilities, strength, and a host of other information. Seeing a system window like this for the first time, the boy couldn't help but wonder what all these numbers meant. Muttering to himself about having 31 stamina, he was suddenly interrupted by the other guy shouting in disbelief, "Wait, you already have stamina." It was then that Choi realized the other guy had been spying on him. The Korean man couldn't believe someone could have 31 stamina right at level 1, but when he learned that Choi was a champion in his past life, it started to make more sense. However, Choi showed zero interest in discussing his stats any further. "Doesn't matter how strong I am," he said flatly. "As long as I'm still a slave, it's useless." With that, he laid down on the cold floor and covered his ears, trying to block out the other guy's overly enthusiastic words of encouragement. The protagonist wasn't in the mood to get friendly or make small talk. For now, he just wanted to be left alone, or at least pretending like that. Time flew by, and it was about the middle of the night when the boy returned to check his status again, hoping there were no intruders. This time, two things caught his eyes. First was mana, which he believed could be used later for superhuman abilities, and hero points. However, he had no idea what the hero points were all about. Despite his curiosity, he tried to ask other proclaimed heroes about it, but none of them had any clue. Suddenly, the space in front of him began to glow once more, just like the day he died. And then out of thin air, someone jumped out, someone with huge melons that distracted the boy. Surprisingly, it was Rachel who appeared, asking the boy to let her explain what hero points were all about. However, something about her was different from the previous version of herself. This time, Rachel looked much smaller and her angelic wings were gone. Without waiting for the boy's response, she started explaining the concept of hero points and how heroes could earn them by completing quests and then use them to gain or improve their abilities. But before Rachel could finish her explanation, the boy suddenly grabbed her tightly, like catching a sparrow. With a terrifying expression, Choi Han-seok declared that he doesn't care about hero points as long as Rachel was in his grasp. After everything he had endured in this harsh life because of her, he just wanted to make her pay for his own satisfaction. Minutes later, after giving her a rough punishment, he tied Rachel to the tip of what looked like a fishing hook, and then he demanded Rachel to confess why she had sent him to this strange place instead of the village he was supposed to arrive at. It didn't take long for her to spill the truth. She explained with a sad and apologetic look that it wasn't intentional. She hadn't meant to trick him or anyone else. She had made a mistake because of an unknown error in her teleportation skill, something she hadn't been aware of. Looking genuinely regretful, Rachel admitted that she was here now to serve him as her punishment. She promised to be his personal fairy, staying by his side until the day he defeated the Demon King. She said this was her way of making amends, believing he was a skilled warrior who could accomplish the mission. However, the protagonist showed no interest in taking Rachel as her personal fairy, or even accepting her words about being a hero or defeating the Demon Lord. He left Rachel stunned as he turned his back on her and announced that all he wanted was to live a normal life, with no intention of fighting anyone. His reason to ignore Rachel and everything she was trying to explain was quite simple, partly because he didn't trust her and partly because he was still angry at her. Rachel was left speechless as she watched Choi Han-seok completely dismiss her and go straight to bed. But then she remembered who she's trying to make a proper conversation. The same clueless guy who only knew how to fight and dreamed of nothing except having a harem of curvy women. Realizing her situation, the fairy started to panic, wondering what would happen to her if he refused to live the life of a warrior. But then, memories of the day she was demoted from a high-ranking angel to a personal fairy flashed through her mind. Back then, she found herself kneeling in front of God, begging for forgiveness for her mistake. Rachel had cried like a child that day, pleading for any other punishment, anything but this. But it was no use. God's decision was final, and now she was stuck with Choi Han-seok whether she liked it or not. It was the last thing she remembered before the main character snapped her back to reality and reminded her that a personal fairy should just do whatever their master says, and so he asked her to listen to him and don't do anything against his will. All of a sudden, the cell door swung open, and the dude leaped out of bed, frantically trying to hide Rachel. A bunch of goblins showed up out of the blue, looking to snatch the boy for some unknown reason. In a hushed tone, Rachel whispered to the boy that she could easily use her stealth skill to hide herself, so he doesn't need to squish her. Then, one of the goblins with a massive sword gave them a scare, announcing that the prison boss, Sir Reedrun, wanted to see the boy. In less than a minute, and without argument, they were in the cowhead orc's office, where he blurted out, "I've heard you've been working hard lately." The boy was shook, because that wasn't true. It seems like the goblin on his shoulder was the one who sweet-talked about him, only because he loved riding on top of the boy and use it as his horse. The orc boss stated he never expected to hear any compliments about Choi after his shady antics on the first day. Then, as a form of appreciation, or maybe as a twisted reward, he offered the boy the top slave position in the prison, shocking everyone. Turns out, Reedrun was scheming to exploit the new boy to level up their building project. All the while, Rachel was whispering in his ear to shut down the cowhead's offer pronto. Seeing how the boy ignored her, Rachel got furious and started yelling, trying to remind him that no hero should ever work for the Demon Lord's army. Even though she used a stealth skill to hide her body, her voice was still loud enough for others to hear. That's when a goblin and a cow-headed orc grew curious about where the girl's voice was coming from. To change the subject and avoid suspicion, the boy had no choice but to hurriedly accept Riedron's offer with a sudden bow, hitting his head on the desk on purpose. His quick move worked, and both the goblin and orc forgot about Rachel's voice. Instead, they were impressed by how respectful the boy's behavior had suddenly become. After that, and with nothing else to discuss, with tears in his eyes, the boy was dismissed and with no other choice left the room. A few days later, in the fortress yard, where slaves were being forced to sing yet another gruesome song about killing and devouring humans, someone stood at the top of a tower, watching and giving orders. Surprisingly, it was Choi Hyun-suk, fully embracing his new role as the head slave. For him, it was a win-win situation, as now he didn't have to work as hard as the other slaves and could secretly develop some of his hidden skills, like charisma. In just a few days, his behavior had changed so much that even the humans around him started doubting if he was the same person as before or really became one of the Demon Lord's man. Rachel tried her hardest to convince the boy to change his mind, but he had already decided to what to do and simply told the fairy to trust the process and nothing else. When he saw a slave collapse to the ground, he immediately started yelling at the poor guy, blaming him for being weak. Right after that, the system popped up again, announcing that the cow-headed orc's favorability towards the boy had increased, and he was now just a few steps away from achieving his goal. Without hesitation, the boy headed straight to Riedron's office, showing respect and thanking him, even though he wasn't sure if the red orc was actually watching him at that moment. Meanwhile, Rachel was losing her patience. She couldn't stand seeing the boy acting like this just to please the demons and began shouting, demanding to know why he was doing all this. Covering his ears, or maybe just scratching his head in frustration, the boy asked Rachel to calm down, explaining that he was only doing it because the system told him to. But Rachel couldn't believe that a system created by the gods would ask a hero to raise a demon's favorability. To prove his point, the boy summoned the system window and showed her the exact message. Even then, Rachel refused to believe it. The message also was contained with some insulting remarks about her, which only made her cry after feeling abandoned by the gods. It seems this message popped up for the first time after they left Riedron's office, where Choi Hyun-suk was about to sleep, but Rachel was so furious that she demanded an explanation before letting him rest so easily. In that night, instead of giving her a convincing explanation to make her calm down, the boy grabbed her in his fist and squeezed her tiny body, angrily blaming her for forcing him into accepting that request. It was in that moment, when all of a sudden a system window appeared with a new quest. It stated that Choi Hyun-suk had ended up in this situation because of a foolish mistake of an idiot, and for making up for that mistake, it was offering him a chance to escape. However, to unlock that chance, he first needed to earn Riedron's favor. At that moment, the boy couldn't help but wonder what all of this was about. However, after some time spent thinking, he finally figured it out. Back to present, he was acting like he was a high-ranking demon in the Demon King's army, ordering and shouting at slaves with a satisfying smile on his ugly face. From Rachel's perspective, none of this made any sense, not the system message nor the boy's behavior. Right then, the goblin who enjoyed riding on the boy's back showed up again and told him that Sir Riedron was asking for his presence. Without wasting much time, the boy arrived at Riedron's office to see why he had been summoned. To his surprise, the cow-headed orc announced that he had received numerous reports saying the slaves' productivity had increased drastically, all thanks to him. In response, the boy started spouting some ridiculous answers, basically implying that he hadn't done anything worth mentioning, and it was because of Sir Riedron himself if any improvement happened. His silly responses only made Rachel even more disappointed in him. However, unlike Rachel, Riedron seemed to like the boy even more after hearing his answers. It boosted the cow-headed orc's favorability toward him, completing the boy's first quest and earning him 100 hero points, something Rachel never expected to happen so suddenly. Unbeknownst to Rachel, Choi Hyun-suk already had a plan in mind after completing this quest. He stepped forward to Riedron's desk and respectfully asked for permission to train the slaves. Riedron looked surprised and asked what exactly the protagonist meant by training the slaves. Completely prepared for this moment, the boy confidently explained his idea, casually painting a picture for Riedron, saying, "Imagine a group of elite worker slaves moving in perfect unison. Slaves who are disciplined experts, doing their tasks with precision and zero laziness. If we train them, they could finish the fortress construction in less than a week." His speech was persuasive, and Riedron seemed intrigued, but the red orc still had his doubts. He questioned whether humans, with their weak and fragile bodies, could really handle such intense training alongside their regular work. Despite this, the boy's suggestion had definitely caught the orc's attention. At that moment, the protagonist played a sneaky trick, declaring that if this plan worked, it would be a huge achievement for Riedron. He even hinted that the higher-ups might hear about it, so why not give him a chance to try? This time, the cow-headed orc was convinced, and agreed to let the boy do whatever he wanted to train the other slaves. And naturally, Choi Hyun-suk expressed his gratitude. Since it was already late, they returned to the cell. But Rachel started crying again, declaring that her hero had lost his mind and didn't know what he was doing. She lamented how she is so unlucky that is forced to live and work as the subordinate of this idiot hero. Seeing the girl crying over and over for no real reason, The boy found it incredibly annoying. That's when he decided to reveal that he actually had a solid plan. At first, Rachel didn't believe him. She assumed Choi was just messing with her again as usual, but this time, the boy was serious. He confidently declared that his real goal was to train the human slaves and, at the right moment, start a rebellion. Sharing just a bit of his insight, he explained that the number of soldiers in the demon army and the number of human slaves were almost equal. Just the humans needed a little time to be prepared to fight. Hearing this, Rachel was deeply moved. For the first time, she felt relieved, realizing she wasn't serving some stupid guy that working for the demon army. After calming Rachel down, the boy had one last thing to do for the night. Check what rewards he could get after completing his first quest and earning 100 hero points. On the other hand, Rachel, being a newbie fairy or pretending to be one, was showing she's not aware that the system had something called the Heroes Store. Without hesitation, the boy decided to try his luck and open the shop, hoping to get something legendary or at least something worth his effort. Eager to see what kind of reward he'd get after finishing his first strange quest, the boy was completely shocked to find out that he wasn't getting a legendary item or skill, but far from it. Instead, his reward was the choice between two F-rank talents. One for holding his breath longer, and the other for holding his poop better. The rest of the available skills weren't much better either. Things like laundry, cooking, cleaning, and other household chores were up for grabs. Rachel burst out laughing, making the boy's already bad mood even worse. For once, Rachel wasn't lying when she explained that it was only a level 1 store, and he'd need to earn more hero points to level it up and unlock better rewards. But what Rachel didn't realize was that this wasn't the time to ask the boy to be reasonable. Losing his temper, Choi Hun-suk lunged at her, trying to grab the girl and give her a good slap on the butt just to vent his frustration. Several days, or maybe weeks later, slaves were lined up in neat rows in the fortress courtyard, ready to salute the Demon King. Predictably, it was the protagonist who had organized them. Afterward, he ordered the slaves to sing another one of their songs about defeating and killing humans. Each group of human slaves, neatly divided into groups of 30, began shouting and singing the song as Choi commanded. A little farther away, Sir Reedrun was watching the scene, feeling relieved that he'd let the boy train the slaves. Just then, someone burst into his office in a hurry. It was one of his subordinates, probably the same goblin who seemed to like Choi Hyun-suk, rushing in to report something urgent. Without wasting time, the goblin announced that the human army was advancing toward their fortress and had already defeated the 8th Division, which was supposed to confront them. The cow-headed orc didn't panic. He calmly assessed the situation. Knowing that the 8th Division was the largest demon army in the area, it didn't take long for him to realize they had no choice but to abandon the fortress and retreat, just as it was nearly completed. The goblin explained that the humans were already very close and warned that the boss needed to escape immediately. But Reedrun had something else on his mind. He turned toward the window and glanced at Choi Hyun-suk. Based on his experience and instincts, the boy seemed like someone who could become valuable in the future. Reedrun wasn't about to abandon him and flee without him. Meanwhile, the protagonist was busy with his daily training, completely unaware of what was going on, until he heard the loud crash of Reedrun's window shattering. Even then, Choi didn't pay much attention to the noise, instead focusing on checking his status. All the while, Reedrun climbed out of the broken window, ready to act. While the protagonist was thinking about how there weren't any sudden events that could boost his status, the red cow-headed orc Reedrun suddenly jumped and landed right behind him. As expected, the boy was startled and couldn't help but wonder what was going on with Reedrun. Without wasting a second, the cow-headed guy told him to follow him immediately. The protagonist was so shocked, he couldn't help but ask why, all of a sudden, he needed to go with the red orc boss. Before Reedrun could explain, the human army appeared out of nowhere, and their leader gave the order to attack. The spearmen charged forward while the bowmen provided cover from the back, catching the goblins completely off guard. Seeing the sheer number of humans, Reedrun quickly realized they were in no position to fight back. To make matters worse, the human slaves began fleeing the battlefield, desperate to save their own lives. Just as the chaos unfolded, a thought crossed the boy's mind. What if I betray Reedrun right now? Or what if I backstab him and take the glory of killing one of the Demon King's generals? The idea of earning honor and recognition as a hero was tempting. But before he could act on it, a human knight suddenly appeared near them, aiming to kill Reedrun. The sight snapped the boy out of his thoughts. Surprisingly, without even breaking a sweat, Reedrun stopped the knight in his tracks by simply grabbing his head with one swift motion. However, Reedrun didn't just stop the knight, he crushed the man's head, squeezing it until it was on the verge of exploding. The protagonist was completely shocked at the sight, but it wasn't over yet. Reedrun lifted the man's body and smashed him into the ground with such force that it didn't just kill the knight instantly. It cracked the area around the impact and sent several soldiers flying from the shockwave. Turning to the boy, the cow-headed orc asked if he was hurt. The protagonist was physically unharmed, but the brutal scene left him terrified. It was the moment when the boy realized it was probably best not to get in Reedrunn's way. Hours later, after the humans had completely taken over the demon fortress, the soldiers began gathering the human slaves, dividing them into different groups. Along with that, they started separating warriors and self-proclaimed heroes from regular civilians. That's when another man arrived, greeting the warriors. It was the commander of the human army, Duke Olivin Grimhere. Shortly after, a soldier approached and reported that they had successfully evacuated all the civilians. The soldier also mentioned that they had drafted everyone claiming to be a hero or warrior. Olivin nodded in approval, thanked the soldier for his work, and reminded him it's the time for the soldiers to do what they're supposed to do. By Duke Olivin's orders, a group of soldiers suddenly drew their swords and surrounded the poor self-proclaimed warriors, catching them off guard, attempting to wipe them out right then and there. Meanwhile, on the other side of the demon territory, several carriages were making their way through the forest. The protagonist was sitting in one of them, regretting his decision to follow Reedrun and join the demon army. The boy hadn't planned to side with a demon, but after witnessing the way Reedrun killed that knight and blew away the others, he felt like he had no choice but to go along. Rachel, however, wasn't upset or angry about the boy abandoning the other humans. Instead, she assumed her warrior was doing all of this as part of some grand plan to get closer to defeating the demon lord, and even thanked Hyunsuk for this matter. Their quiet conversation ended up waking Reedrun, who had only fallen asleep a few minutes earlier. The cow-headed orc opened his eyes and asked if the boy had something he wanted to say to him. Choi Hyunsuk's expression shifted immediately, and he quickly pretended he was just mumbling about how honored he felt to be traveling with Reedrun. Hearing this, Reedrun's expression changed as well. He declared how pleased he was to hear such words. To the boy's surprise, the cow-headed orc then announced that he would officially enlist Choi Hyunsuk's name in the demon army as soon as they arrived at their destination. The protagonist forced himself to say how much of a huge honor this was, but internally he was panicking and feeling completely the opposite. After a few hours, just as the sun had set, they finally arrived at the Third Corps' headquarters. They entered the castle, and Reedrun told the boy to follow him, saying he wanted to take him straight to the commander. Still with tears in his eyes and a sad expression, Choi Hyunsuk found himself in no position to refuse Reedrun's request. To make things worse, Reedrun added to the boy's fear by warning him to be extremely careful with his behavior in front of the commander, or else he'd end up dead within the first minute. With no desire to lose his life, Choi Hyunsuk reluctantly accepted this as just another challenge he needed to survive. He followed the cow-headed orc down the halls until they reached the commander's room. Reedrun announced his presence and politely asked for permission to enter. After a few seconds of silence, a voice finally responded, granting them permission to come in. It was a woman's voice, and this immediately got Choi Hyunsuk thinking, was the terrifying commander Reedrun warn him about a woman, or was it just the voice of a female gatekeeper? All his questions were answered the moment he stepped into the room. Standing before him was the demon commander, a woman with melons bigger than watermelons, which, of course, caught his attention even more than the day he laid eyes on Rachel's lemons. On the other hand, the demon commander acted like she was reuniting with her long-lost boyfriend. She practically beamed with happiness, making it clear how thrilled she was to see Reedrun again after such a long time. The boy's eyes widened in shock, realizing that such a stunningly beautiful demon could really exist, and on top of that, she was a commander that Reedrun clearly respected a lot. While Reedrun and Commander Hemis exchanged sweet compliments about each other's muscles and looks, the boy couldn't help but wonder if he should also do the same and say something to praise Commander Hemis's beauty. But before he could open his mouth, Reedrun stepped forward and apologized for failing to protect the newly built fortress. To his surprise, the demon woman wasn't mad at him at all. Instead, she shifted the blame onto the 8th Division's commander, saying it was his failure that caused all of this chaos. Laughing, but clearly holding some anger inside, Commander Hemis announced that she should have made a bag out of that loser when she had the chance. As she spoke, a dark aura started to surround her, enveloping the room and making it hard for the boy to breathe. His hands trembled in fear under the overwhelming pressure, realizing he'd never experienced anything like this before. Hennis, however, didn't seem interested in dragging out the past. Instead, she turned her gaze to Reedrun and demanded to know why he had brought a human all the way into the depths of demon territory. Reedrun, calm as ever, explained that he's the one who he had already reported he'd be bringing, that without hesitation he introduced Choi Hyun-suk and stated that he wanted to officially enlist him in the demon army. Catching the boy completely off guard, Hemi suddenly appeared in front of him, calling him cutie. However, it wasn't just his appearance that caught her attention. She seemed far more interested in his potential, as she was confident there had to be a good reason why Reedrun had personally chosen a human and gone through the trouble of bringing him all the way here. With a concerned look, Hemis reminded Reedrun that with his fragile human body, the boy wouldn't last long in the demon army, something Reedrun was already well aware of. The cow-headed orc explained that he had a plan to personally train the boy and requested his commander's permission to let him start right away. Hemis, however, refused. She told Reedrun that someone like him shouldn't waste his time training a weak and ugly human, but it was clear she had something else in mind to help Reedrun's favorite human survives. Out of nowhere, Hemis made a sudden move and began transforming her head into something else entirely. In mere moments, a strange aura surrounded her, causing the air to feel heavy. To the boy's utter disbelief, her head shifted into what looked like a wild carnivorous plant. Choi Hyun-suk stood there, dumbfounded, his jaw practically hitting the floor as he stared at the bizarre transformation. But things only got weirder when Hamish reached into depths of her plant-like mouth and pulled out a cute, demonic creature, something that looked like a mix between a cat and a dog. As her head returned to its normal shape, she held up the pet and declared that, from now on, Choi Hyun-suk should be her new pet caretaker. The creature's name was Bobo, and as soon as it laid eyes on the boy, its cute face instantly twisted into something resembling a dog, ready to devour its next meal. The boy was both amazed and horrified at the same time, first by the commander's bizarre head transformation, second by her casually pulling a living pet out of her stomach, and lastly by Hemis asking him to take care of it. His obvious reaction didn't go unnoticed by Commander Hemis. She immediately changed her tone, narrowing her eyes as she asked, "Do you dare not like Bobo?" Finding himself in a life-or-death situation, the boy didn't hesitate. He straightened up, gave a military-style salute, and declared that it would be a great honor to take care of Bobo. Hemis, clearly satisfied with his response, handed the creature over without another word. As she did, she began casually explaining a few things about Bobo, like how it goes absolutely feral when it's hungry, or how it had eaten all of its previous caretakers. Meanwhile, the protagonist stood stiffly, nodding along to her words, too terrified to stop Bobo from gnawing his head. A few minutes later, the meeting ended and they moved to a room inside the castle, which had a poster of Bobo plastered on the door. It felt like the chaos was only just beginning. In the middle of it all, the main character suddenly received another quest from the system. The timing couldn't have been worse, and even Rachel was caught off guard. The quest was about to survive by gaining Bobo's affection. The reward, 200 hero points. The boy started thinking deeply about the reward he was going to get, but something didn't make sense to him. Glancing at the sleeping Bobo, he couldn't help but wonder how on earth he was supposed to gain the affection of this creature. Just then the door creaked open, and someone walked into the room. As expected, it was an ugly goblin who worked as Bobo's caretaker. The moment he entered, the boy quickly introduced himself and greeted the goblin respectfully. While secretly sizing up the goblin, Choi Hyun-suk couldn't shake the feeling that this creature sees him as nothing more than a walking human snack. Trying to keep his cool, the boy asked if there were any other senior caretakers he needed to know about. The goblin simply repeated Commander Hemis's words, stating that he was the only one left, because Bobo had eaten all the others. With nothing else to discuss, the goblin got straight to the point and told the boy he'd need to help prepare Bobo's meals from now on. In an almost bossy tone, he urged Choi Hyun-suk to start his work immediately. But before the boy could respond, chaos erupted. The goblin's loud voice had woken up Bobo, and in an instant the creature appeared on top of the goblin, licking the goblin's ugly head like it was a piece of candy. The goblin froze, realizing he was about to kick the bucket. Panicked, the goblin dashed behind Choi Hyun-suk in hope to get sheltered and began trembling with fear. Desperate to save his own life, he started offering the boy his food to distract Bobo and save his life for the day. It was clear the goblin was scared to his very core, but his cowardice left Choi Hyun-suk in an awkward and dangerous position. The boy didn't see it coming and was completely caught off guard by the goblin. But Choi Hyun-suk wasn't the type to let a tiny goblin force him into sacrificing his life. Without hesitation, he grabbed the goblin's belt and hurled it with all his strength. On the other side, Bobo was prepared for this moment, eagerly waiting for its snack. Despite its size, it didn't take long for Bobo to finish eating the goblin in less than a few minutes. The way Bobo tore apart and devoured the goblin made both Choi Hyun-sok and Rachel realize one thing. This dog really loved goblin meat. After feeding Bobo, a new problem popped up. Bobo wanted a playmate, and unfortunately, Rachel was the only one who could meet its expectations. But poor Rachel wasn't thrilled about playing with Bobo, mainly because she could get killed any second. She was frantically begging for help, but the boy just ignored her. Worse, he even told her not to run too much because it might make Bobo hungry again. Choi Hyun-suk actually had a reason for ignoring Rachel. He was busy searching for something in the hero's store. It didn't take him long to find it, an extra-large bone designed to grab the attention of any monster. He bought it on the spot. He jumped to action. Calling Bobo's name was enough to grab the dog's attention. Holding up the bone, Choi changed his tone and asked if Bobo wanted it. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he tossed the bone into the air. Just as he expected, Bobo's eyes locked onto it. Faster than any dog, Bobo leapt and caught the bone in midair. After being forced to fly around for a while, Rachel finally managed to take a short break thanks to Hyun-suk. Panting, Rachel couldn't believe she's saved, wondering how the boy had found such an attractive bone in the hero's store. Choi Hyun-suk, feeling proud of himself, started bragging about how much of a genius he was and how it wouldn't take him long to complete any quest. Little did he know, Bobo was already coming for him. Luckily, Bobo missed its target, but that was the moment the boy froze in shock, realizing things weren't going to be as easy as he thought. It turned out Bobo had already devoured the large bone, and, with the boy's collar clenched between its teeth, was making it very clear that one bone wasn't enough. Staring at Bobo, the terrified boy quickly realized the dog needed more fresh food, preferably something besides his own flesh. That's when Rachel suggested they take Bobo outside to find something more suitable to eat. Her words gave the boy an idea to save himself from being Bobo's next meal. Thinking hard, he tried to come up with a magical word that could calm any pet. Suddenly, inspiration struck and he shouted, "Walk!" In an unexpected twist, Bobo's entire demeanor changed. It was like the dog-like creature had two completely different personalities. Instantly, it turned into a playful house pet version of itself, excited and full of energy. Acting like a puppy eager for a walk, Bobo jumped straight into the boy's arms. Minutes later, Choi Hyun-suk found himself running around the castle like Batman, chasing after Bobo while desperately searching for a kitchen to find something edible for the dog. Rachel, on the other hand, was also looking for a place where they could find food for Bobo, but couldn't find any trace. That's when she spotted a goblin running away and immediately told the boy to stop him. Not to feed him to Bobo, but to ask where the castle's kitchen was. The protagonist did as Rachel suggested, but the goblin wasn't thrilled about being stopped by a human. Before the situation could escalate, Bobo stepped in, acting like it wanted food right now. Of course, this scared the life out of the goblin, who immediately thought he was next on the menu. In the blink of an eye, the goblin found himself cornered with no chance of escape as Bobo started preparing to devour him. Fortunately or unfortunately, the boy stepped in and stopped Bobo, announcing that he was Bobo's new caretaker and that they were just looking for the kitchen to feed him. The goblin didn't waste a second and used the opportunity to flee from Bobo. But just before disappearing, he quickly told them to go left to reach the kitchen. The goblin's terrified reaction first left the boy and Rachel stunned, but it didn't take long before they burst into laughter. They couldn't help but wonder why a goblin in the demon army would act so pathetic against a pet. Laughing and having fun after such a long time was something the boy had been craving. But just as he was busy cracking jokes, he suddenly realized something. Bobo was gone and was nowhere around to be found. Panic set in as he thought about what would happen if Commander Hemis found out he lost her beloved pet. Without wasting another second, he immediately started searching the castle frantically, determined to find the dog-like creature before being summoned by Hemis. After searching desperately for a few minutes, they couldn't find any trace of Bobo. With tears in his eyes and concerned, Hyun-suk thought, just 1 minute is enough for Bobo to cause a disaster. He was certain he'd be the one to face the consequences of Bobo's actions. Rachel was also looking around frantically, trying to find the dog. Just then, she noticed something moving toward them. It was Bobo. However, it seemed like the dog had already caused trouble as its mouth and body were covered in blood. Seeing Bobo brought Hyunsuk a brief moment of relief, making him think maybe he's saved now. But as soon as Bobo sat down in front of him like a well-behaved dog, loud shouting and screaming filled the air. From the commotion, it became clear that Bobo had found someone, and not just anyone. It seems the dog had killed someone's captain and possibly even eaten him in a short time when they missed him. Choi Hyunsuk and Rachel stood there, completely stunned. Hyunsuk's worst fears were confirmed. This was exactly the disaster he had been terrified of, and it had actually happened. Out of nowhere, a group of goblins appeared, furious and ready to catch the one who had killed their leader, chasing after protagonist's team. The boy grabbed Bobo and, alongside Rachel, ran as fast as he could. Unfortunately, as he was newbie in castle, he soon found himself cornered in a dead end. The goblins had no idea that Bobo had devoured their captain, as they had only found parts of his corpse. Seeing a human in their castle made them certain he was the one responsible for killing their captain. As monsters that eat any kind of meat, even their own kind, each goblin began imagining how they would divide the boy's body among themselves after killing him. Hyunsuk frantically searched for a way to save himself. Finally, an idea hit him, and he shouted, "How dare you!" That's when he realized the situation was far worse than he had thought. It wasn't just a few goblins that had cornered him, but an entire army. Even so, he didn't hesitate. Pointing at Bobo, he shouted again, asking how they didn't recognize the commander's pet. It seemed none of the goblins had seen Bobo before. So one of them hesitantly said, "Isn't it just a monster?" In response, Hyunsuk started yelling at the goblin, declaring that it shouldn't dare call Bobo a monster. With a furious voice, he brought Bobo closer and loudly announced the dog's name. The goblins seemed to recognize the name Bobo, though the dog's appearance didn't match their memory. They started to wonder if this could really be the same Bobo, Commander Hemi's pet, or if the boy was just trying to trick them to save his life. The boy had expected this to happen, so he put Bobo down, ready to prove to everyone whether it was really the commander's pet or not. In an instant, Bobo's beast mode switched on, whether by the boy's command or its own instincts, and it attacked the goblin who had doubted that it was the famous Bobo. The boy didn't interfere, and calmly watched as Bobo tore into the unfortunate goblin. Within a minute, nothing was left of the poor creature except its skeleton. Taking advantage of the situation, Hyunsuk asked if anyone else had something to say about Bobo. Not a single goblin dared to speak up. Instead, they all bowed and showed their respect. In that moment, the boy's hidden attribute, charisma, increased as he managed to subdue so many goblins. Just then, someone else entered the scene to check what all the noise was about. It was Commander Hemis herself, catching Hyunsuk completely off guard with her sudden appearance. Luckily, he had already managed to settle the situation. Not long after, they returned to Commander Hemis's office, where the demon woman asked the boy directly if he really had to use her name and Bobo to survive. Fully aware of the situation, Choi Hyunsuk dropped to his knees before Hemis, confessing and apologizing for what he called his grave sin. To his surprise, the commander didn't say all this to blame him. Actually, she was complimenting him for his cleverness. Short time later, in a sudden move, Hems approached and gently touched the boy's face, admiring him for not being as foolish as other demons. The demon woman also mentioned how much she liked the way Hyunsuk acted without fear. She even made a comment about him having guts. Returning to her seat, Hems explained why she had taken an interest in him. She said she noticed he was different from most demons who act purely on brute force, without thinking, and ultimately cause a lot of trouble. The boy couldn't fully understand what she meant by demons causing trouble, so he asked for more details. Hemis, however, told him to wait, saying she believed he would figure it out on his own soon enough. Then, out of nowhere, Commander Hemis asked him if he had ever thought about becoming her exclusive. Hyunsuk was completely bewildered. He couldn't believe the commander was even considering making him her exclusive, especially given his current skills and level. It seemed impossible to him. However, Hemis clarified that she didn't mean to make him her exclusive right away, as doing so wouldn't be good for her reputation. Instead, she explained that there was a decisive battle system in the demon army, one that allowed anyone to challenge their opponent and take their rank if they won. To help the human improve, Hemis offered to put him under her protection for a month, but after that he would have to fight against opponents of her choosing. By accepting this offer, Hyunsuk could extend her protection month by month, as long as he continued to defeat the opponents she picked for him, one by one. Hemis had planned all of this to help the boy slowly climb the ladder of advancement, hoping he would eventually become a battalion commander like Reedrun and prove himself useful. However, the boy couldn't help but wonder what would happen if he lost a match. Revealing a hint of her cannibalistic form, Hemis responded coldly, warning him not to expect anything less than a painful death after that. Moments later, Hyunsuk found himself outside the commander's office. He had agreed to do as Hemi instructed, but he was already regretting his decision. To make matters worse, Hemius had chosen an opponent for him on the spot, someone so formidable that Rachel immediately assumed she'd have to say farewell to him forever after the next month. Desperate to find some inspiration, the boy turned to Rachel and asked if she remembered the day she called him an SSS rank hero. She replied that she did, but then began to explain what she had meant that day. It wasn't a guarantee. She had been referring to his potential, something that could happen but wasn't certain. Hyunsuk had been hoping for encouragement, but instead Rachel's words left him feeling disappointed and deflated. It wasn't what he wanted to hear at that moment. Just as despair began to creep in, he suddenly found himself standing in front of a massive door, its surface covered in dried blood. He immediately realized it must be the castle's kitchen and decided to check it out. As soon as he opened the door, he was met with something, or rather someone, who asked if he was the human the commander had talked about. That orc, ogre, big red goblin, or whatever it was, introduced himself as Kulkan, the chef of the demon army. Kulkan then asked why the boy had come there. Choi Hyun-suk, feeling a bit embarrassed, hesitantly asked if there was any chance he could get a snack for Bobo. To his surprise, Chef Kulkan flat out refused. He showed no interest in helping the boy, stating that the only order he had received from Commander Hemis was not to harm the human in the castle. Beyond that, Kulkan clearly didn't care. However, Hyunsuk knew he wouldn't last long if he didn't find something for Bobo, so he persisted, continuing to ask for help. Seeing how desperate the boy was, the chef, with a side glance to show where he meant, told the boy to go himself and get one. Hyunsuk looked in the direction Kulkan had gestured and noticed a group of goblins a little further behind the chef. They were busy butchering some green monster, laughing and celebrating as they chopped it into pieces and enjoyed their gruesome feast. It seemed like they were throwing a party, celebrating the death of one of their comrades while turning them into a tasty meal. Watching their disturbing behavior and their grotesque appearance, Hyunsuk couldn't help but wonder if all those goblins were butchers or cooks working in the kitchen. Stuck between witnessing the goblins' macabre meat party from afar and the towering Chef Kulkan standing intimidatingly close in front of him, the boy wondered how on earth he was supposed to get a snack for Bobo. Without any warning, the scene shifted to a forest where the main character found himself face to face with a giant wild boar. But he wasn't alone. He'd been forced to tag along with a group of goblins to hunt something for dinner. Before the boar could reach him, its attention shifted to another goblin, and with one swift strike, the boar killed it. The goblin's lifeless body was tossed in front of the boy, who couldn't help but wonder who would end up as dinner, the goblins or the boar. Rachel suggested they should run to avoid ending up like that poor goblin, but with so many eyes on them, the boy thought it was impossible. Still, Hyunsuk knew Rachel was right. Their lives were in serious danger, and he figured the best plan was to hide somewhere for now. Unfortunately, just as he was thinking this, someone summoned him. The boy stood up and nervously announced that he was ready to risk his life for dinner. It turned out to be Chef Kulkan, who had called him. However, Kulkan quickly said Hyunsuk didn't need to fight the boar after all, as the boar, already outnumbered, had been killed and the hunt was over. The main character was shocked. He hadn't expected the goblins to actually succeed after watching them charge in so recklessly. A little while later, a scruffy, ugly goblin entered the scene to give a report on the hunt's outcome. According to him, 12 goblins had been killed, and many more were injured because of that wild boar. The boy was shocked to realize the goblin army had taken way more damage than he initially thought, but unlike him, Chef Kulkan seemed pleased with the outcome. Giving a thumbs up, Kulkan casually told the goblins to start searching for their next prey after a short break. Before long, the boy found himself standing alone, deep in thought. Hiding and running away didn't seem like an option anymore. Hearing this, Rachel's eyes widened in disbelief. She asked if Hyunsuk was seriously considering joining the goblins for their next hunt. The boy shook his head and explained that what he really needed was to level up his stats, and for that, he needed experience. Then he shared an idea that left Rachel speechless. He wondered if he could still earn experience points if he only delivered the final blow to kill a monster. Rachel hesitated but confirmed that it would work. However, she wasn't a fan of the plan, calling it a sloppy and underhanded move. Hyun-sok didn't care. Ignoring Rachel's opinion, he simply turned around and started walking. He knew he had to get much stronger in a month, and as a weak human, this was the only way he could do it. After some time searching, he finally found Chef Kulkan. Before Hyun-sok could say a word, the chef smirked and said, "I thought you ran away." Hyun-sok quickly replied that he'd never do such a thing, but in his head, he wondered if the goblin chef could somehow read minds. Without wasting any time, he asked Chef Kulkan for permission to join the next hunt. The red orc looked surprised, glancing at the boy with a terrifying expression that made Hyun-sok break out in a cold sweat. For a moment, he wondered if he had crossed some kind of line. But suddenly, Chef Kulkan burst into loud laughter, declaring that he liked the boy's boldness. With an awkward smile, Hyun-sok thanked the chef for his kind words, but his confidence immediately vanished when Kulkan added that Hyun-sok would have to lead the next hunt. Kulkan gave him a thumbs up and explained that they had a lot of respect for those who took charge, even if it was just for a short time. Then, to Hyun-sok's shock, Kulkan said it was the first time he'd ever let a newcomer, especially a human, take the lead. Panicking, Hyun-sok tried to come up with an excuse to decline. He stammered something about how others might complain or even cause chaos if he became the leader. But before Kulkan could respond, a goblin came sprinting toward them, shouting the chef's name from a distance. The urgency in the goblin's voice made Chef Kulkan frown, wondering if something serious had happened. As the goblin ran as fast as his little legs could carry him, he yelled, "Monster invasion!" But the warning wasn't really necessary, as the deafening cries of the Arun herd were already echoing through the forest, announcing their arrival loud and clear. Unfamiliar with Urun monsters, the terrified protagonist nervously asked Chef Kulkan if their lives were in danger. To his surprise, the chef didn't seem concerned at all. In fact, Kulkan didn't like the invasion for a completely unexpected reason. He thought Urun meat wasn't tasty, but still, he wasn't about to pass up free food that was practically delivering itself to them. Pulling out his massive cleaver, Kulkan ordered everyone else to do the same, not to defend themselves, but to prepare for adding Urun meat stew to the night's menu. Hyun-sik was both shocked and relieved at the same time. If this was how they handled invasions, it meant the only thing he needed to do was stick close and steal some kills. To help her master, Rachel decided to use one of her skills to slightly boost his strength and health. However, the effect wouldn't last long. It would disappear after just 3 minutes. The boy was amazed as he suddenly felt lighter and stronger, like his body had been supercharged. Expecting some gratitude for her effort, Rachel was instead met with a punch on the head. "Why didn't you use this earlier?" Hyun-suk scolded her, completely ignoring her good intentions. With his newfound strength and a burning desire to rack up as many last hits as possible, Hyun-suk bolted toward the battlefield. For motivation, he painted a vivid picture in his mind, a future where a blonde noble girl waited for him, along with 5 kids who depended on him to grow stronger and protect them. This ridiculous but oddly inspiring thought gave him enough energy to leap into action like an overexcited grasshopper, hoping to score his first kill. It didn't take long for Hyun-suk to score his first last hit, taking down his first Urun, a creature that looked a lot like a wolf. As soon as the monster fell, he leveled up 4 times in one go, something he never imagined would happen. Overwhelmed with excitement, Hyun-suk started dreaming big, setting his sights on reaching level 20 by the end of the day. As time passed, the battle became more brutal. Many goblins lost their lives in the fight, but they managed to take down the swarm of Aruns. Just as one injured goblin staggered forward to finish off the last Arun, Hyun-suk suddenly appeared out of nowhere. He shoved the goblin aside with a heavy elbow strike, mumbling an insincere apology about slipping. With a crazed grin that made him look possessed, Hyun-suk shouted, "Every last hit in the world is mine. Mine and mine alone." After some time, Hyun-suk found himself standing apart from the group of goblins, watching them butcher and pack up the meat from the boars and Uruns. Rachel appeared next to him, her expression somewhere between tired and completely bored. "Is the hunting finally over, or are we still going?" she asked flatly. Hyun-suk smirked and called her his buff bot, replying that every monster in the area had already been killed and the goblins were almost done packing up the meat. But then his smirk quickly disappeared as he noticed some of the goblins sneaking bites of the meat they were supposed to bring back as supplies for their army. The protagonist was completely clueless about what was happening, That's when Chef Kulkan gently placed a hand on his shoulder, snapping the boy out of his daze and asking why he'd been staring for so long. Taken by surprise, Hyun-suk blurted out, "Wait, are goblin soldiers really allowed to eat the army's food like that?" Unlike the stunned boy, Kukaren remained calm as he explained. It's one of the privileges of being cooks and hunters. They get to enjoy fresh meat as a reward for their hard work. Honestly, it's the only reason they're willing to risk their necks in these deadly hunts. The explanation didn't sit well with Hyun-suk. It made no sense to him. He couldn't imagine putting his life on the line just for a chance to eat fresh food. To him, it wasn't worth the danger, no matter how good the food might be. On the other hand, Chef Kulkan seemed impressed with the boy's efforts. Smiling, he praised Hyun-suk's hard work as a warrior and offered him a piece of his own food as a sign of respect. Hyun-suk stared at the chunk of meat in front of him, already bitten into, and hesitated. Could this really taste as good as Kulkan claimed? After some internal debate, he decided to give it a shot. Taking a cautious bite, the first thing he noticed was that the meat wasn't bad at all, but at the same time, it wasn't anything special either. It felt oddly chewy and surprisingly bland, leaving him a little underwhelmed. Watching the goblins celebrate so enthusiastically made him question why they would risk their lives for such mediocre, sloppy meat. It was baffling. Then, in a flash, a wild idea struck him, making him shout, "What if I can make a dish way better than this?" He didn't mean to shout, but the thought consumed him. If he could create something truly delicious, he was sure he could win everyone's favor, and maybe even control them if his plan worked. Without waiting for Rachel's opinion, he opened the hero's store. Raising his hand like a crazed rock star, he remembered he only had 70 hero points left and would need to spend them wisely to achieve his goal. He already knew what he needed and didn't hesitate. His hand began glowing as Rachel looked on, confused. It became clear soon enough. He spent 20 hero points on seasonings, including salt, and the remaining 50 on an F-rank cooking skill that would improve his culinary abilities. Rachel could only wonder what he was up to without saying a word. The fairy girl Rachel was furious at Choi Hyun-suk, yelling at him because she thought he was just wasting his precious hero points on useless items. On the other hand, the boy realized it was pointless to argue with Rachel, so instead he decided to show her what he was up to. He slowly turned the meat over the fire and carefully sprinkled salt on it, acting like he had been a world-famous chef his whole life. He treated the simple act of seasoning the meat like it was the most important thing in the world. To Hyun-suk, that piece of meat was glowing, and he was convinced it had become much more delicious than before. He was brimming with confidence and couldn't help but wonder if he's going to become a legendary boss in this strange new world, simply by cooking this kind of delicious food. Then, in a sudden move, Hyun-suk, instead of eating the meat himself, offered it to Chef Kulkan. However, Kulkan, who was already full, politely declined. But Hyun-suk wasn't about to give up. He bowed deeply and begged the chef to at least take one small bite as a test. Determined to make his dream come true, Hyun-suk was willing to do whatever it took to get Chef Kulkan to try the meat. Finally, tired of the boy's persistence, Kulkan gave in and took a bite, just to get him to stop. The moment the meat touched his tongue, Kulkan was overwhelmed with nostalgia. It was as if he had been transported back in time to his childhood, the days when his mother lovingly cooked meat for dinner, or the times when his father took him to visit a renowned chef for a special meal. Those sweet dreams about how wonderful his childhood was with his family played vividly in his mind. Before he even realized it, he was back in his adult self again. All those warm memories made the chef tear up like a little kid, realizing just how much he missed his beloved mother. Several hours later, when they returned to the castle, Kulkan handed the boy a full bag of snacks for Bobo, as a token of gratitude for giving him the most delicious food he'd ever tasted, just like his mother used to make. Not long after, Hyun-suk arrived at Bobo's house. He playfully swung the door open and called out for Bobo. But before he could even tell the demon dog that he brought snacks, Bobo surprised him with a sudden pounce. Thankfully, Hyun-suk had already prepared for emergencies like this. Instead of letting himself get caught, he quickly shoved a snack into Bobo's mouth. Bobo's aggressive, hungry demeanor immediately shifted into a happy and grateful one. His tail wagged furiously as he chewed on the treat, clearly enjoying every bite after waiting so long. Seeing how hungry Bobo was, Hyun-suk decided to hand over everything he had brought from the kitchen. With a grin, he declared that Bobo could eat all of it because he'd make sure to get even more snacks tomorrow. The puppy didn't expect to get so much of its favorite food, and it was completely amazed. Not knowing how to show its appreciation since it couldn't talk like most pets, it simply stared up at Hyun-suk with wide, sparkling eyes. That was the moment Bobo's affinity increased enough to meet the requirements for the quest. Hyun-suk's second task was now complete, and he earned 200 more hero points, just like that. The boy had expected this outcome, and seeing his efforts pay off so quickly made him feel pretty satisfied. Rachel, on the other hand, was watching him with a mix of awe and curiosity, wondering what Hyun-suk would do next now that he was making progress with the quest. Feeling more confident than ever, Hyun-suk opened his status screen to check everything. That's when he noticed something surprising. Along with his hero points, he had a stash of bonus points he hadn't used yet. The problem? He had no idea what are they and how he even can use them, all because he had skipped the tutorial on the very first day. Rachel, noticing his confusion, tried to explain how the bonus points worked. Hyun-suk, half joking but also annoyed, blamed Rachel for not telling him something this important sooner. Of course, the fairy girl reluctantly accepted the blame and quickly tried to make up for her earlier mistake. To make things right, Rachel began explaining everything she should have told him on the first day. According to her, those bonus points could be used to increase 4 basic stats: strength, stamina, agility, and mana. Each of these stats was unique and useful in its own way, depending on what Hyun-suk wanted to focus on. Hyun-suk remembered he had increased something else called charisma, so he asked Rachel if it was similar to his basic stats. The fairy girl explained that charisma is a hidden stat and can only be leveled up through specific training, not by using bonus points. She then advised her master to distribute his bonus points equally across all the stats. However, Hyun-suk was seriously considering dumping all of them into his strength stat. In Rachel's opinion, that was the worst idea ever. She warned him that if he did that, he'd definitely regret it later. To make her point clearer, she explained that Hyun-suk would eventually be able to enhance his body with mana, which would make him much stronger than someone who had invested everything into just strength. Surprisingly, Rachel's advice actually seemed to sink in for the first time, and Hyun-suk decided to follow her suggestion. He spread his bonus points evenly across all the stats and confirmed the changes. Once that was done, Rachel mentioned that he could now buy the Fundamentals of Mana Control from the Hero Shop, which would help him in the future. Hyun-suk, clueless about what mana control even was, decided to trust Rachel's advice, since she clearly knew more about this world than he did. He searched the Hero Shop for a while, but no matter how hard he looked, he couldn't find anything resembling what Rachel had described. Poor Rachel was completely embarrassed. She had been so confident, acting like this item definitely existed, but it turned out there was no such thing. Hyun-suk immediately regretted trusting her again and started teasing her, accusing her of lying and tricking him for no reason. 3 weeks flew by and the protagonist was lying flat on the ground, completely exhausted after non-stop training to reach level 100. Checking his status, Hyun-suk couldn't help but wonder if any hero in this world was working as hard as he was. However, Rachel quickly shattered his sense of pride, casually calling him a sinecure. That one word was enough to get on Hyun-suk's nerves. Furious, he grabbed Rachel and slammed her onto the ground multiple times, taking full advantage of her small size. While being wildly tossed around, the fairy girl frantically explained that she wasn't trying to insult him. She clarified that what she meant was that most ordinary heroes take at least 6 months to reach level 100, while it only took him 3 weeks. Now looking like a squashed yellow blob on the ground, poor Rachel weakly added that she hadn't meant to offend him by calling him a sinecure. She was just trying to be friendly. In the middle of their argument, the door suddenly opened, and a goblin entered Bobo's house. The goblin announced the commander Hemis had sent him to immediately bring Hyun-suk to her office. A few minutes later, Choi Hyun-suk arrived at the commander's office. As usual, Hemis was lounging casually in her chair, greeting him with a warm welcome. With just a single glance, she instantly noticed how much stronger Hyun-suk had gotten since the last time they met. Even his mana had nearly doubled, and her sharp eyes didn't miss it. Showing respect and gratitude, Hyun-suk thanked Commander Hemis and then mentioned that he had been feeding Bobo the best meat and snacks every day as she ordered. However, the commander didn't seem to care much about Bobo at the moment. Her mind was entirely preoccupied with how quickly Hyun-suk was getting stronger in such a short amount of time, or at least pretending to be. Out of nowhere, she asked him, "Is this because of the level system for heroes?" The sudden question shocked Hyun-suk the most. He froze, unable to hide his confusion, and couldn't help but wonder, does the commander actually know I was supposed to be a hero? Seeing how surprised he looked, Hemis tried to calm him down, casually explaining that she had known the truth from the very first day they met. With a shaky voice, Hyun-suk got the courage to finally ask how she had figured that out, but Hemis didn't answer. Instead, she ignored his question entirely and redirected the conversation, asking him to think about why she had summoned him in the first place. Trembling slightly, Hyun-suk started blurting out nonsense, throwing out random guesses like, for Bobo's training? Or maybe kill stealing? Or something naughty? After rambling for a while, it finally hit him. He had been called here because of the promise of a battle in a month. Realizing this, Hyun-suk relaxed a little. Since the boy had been training so hard and believed he had done his absolute best, he grew confident, assuming he was about to be praised again for his efforts. At first, Commander Hemis acted like she was about to praise his hard work, but in a split second, she showed her true colors and started yelling at Hyun-sol, saying his progress in leveling up wasn't as fast as she'd expected. Hemis, with her carnivorous plant appearance, declared that she expected him to grow much more as a hero, and that's the only reason she allowed him to stay in the demon army. And as a final warning, she ordered Hyun-suk to work much harder if he wanted to stay alive. The boy was both shocked and scared, but what shook him even more was hearing that Hemis only wanted to make him stronger for being used as her own entertainment, at least for now. Shortly after receiving her warning, Choi Hyun-suk left her room and found a quiet spot to reflect on his grim situation. He was convinced that Hemis was just using him as a pawn in some crazy plot twist to grab the attention of her audience, and of course, for her own amusement. What really bothered him was the fact that he'd already seen this coming, yet there was no way for him to escape it. To make things worse, Rachel was only adding to his frustration by panicking and constantly getting on his nerves. All of a sudden, the protagonist made a decision. To increase his chance of success, and also to quickly learn more about his opponent before the battle, he started searching for an item in the hero's store that could help him. Rachel, still in full panic mode, reminded Hyun-suk that they only knew the name of his opponent, not what they looked like, so buying an item for this situation would be pointless. As usual, Hyun-suk ignored Rachel's concerns as he already spotted an item that seemed perfect for the situation. Without even waiting for Rachel to finish talking, he bought it. The item looked like a pair of stylish glasses and was called the Combat Power Meter. With this, Hyun-suk could easily measure anyone's stats. Rachel's panicked expression quickly turned into one of surprise. She acted like it was the first time she'd seen an item like this, and to be fair, it actually was. The boy then tried to explain how he planned to use it, but only in bits and pieces, as he was too excited to focus on explaining properly. Sarcastically, Hyun-suk declared that this item would be way more useful to him than Rachel ever was. Meanwhile, to test it out, he decided to use it on Rachel first. The moment he looked at her through the glasses, the item displayed a battle power of 375. However, neither of them had any idea if that number was high or low. Hoping to get some context, they decided Rachel should use the item to measure Hyun-suk's battle power as well. The glasses looked ridiculously oversized compared to Rachel's tiny frame, so Hyun-suk had to help her hold them up for a moment. Rachel took a good look at the boy through the lenses but stayed quiet for a while. Hyun-suk, growing impatient, expected her to announce some numbers about his power. But when Rachel didn't say anything, he started wondering if maybe he is the only one who could use this item. Finally, Rachel broke her silence. She admitted she could see the numbers but immediately declared that the item must be broken, or something like that. Rachel was trying to act surprised, but deep down she was utterly disappointed. Seeing that Hyun-suk was nearly 5 times stronger than her was a hard pill to swallow. Making a huge fuss about it, she dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face as the realization hit her. The realization of how she, as a powerful and high-ranking angel, in just a month, had turned into someone much weaker than a human. Meanwhile, Hyun-suk didn't pay much attention to Rachel's meltdown. Instead, he focused on testing the item to make sure it worked properly. Curious, he decided to try it out on Bobo. What he saw next left him stunned. Bobo's strength was over 47,000. It suddenly made sense why everyone in the demon army seemed so terrified of Commander Hemi's pet. But for Rachel, this revelation was even worse. The fact that a demonic pet was almost 120 times stronger than her crushed what little pride she had left. The thought of how weak she was compared to Bobo made her want to quit on life altogether. After a while, Rachel finally calmed down. They decided to take a walk around the area, curious to see just how strong the rest of the demon army really was. Hyun-suk had already guessed that the goblin soldiers were probably the weakest among the demons, and sure enough, according to the item, every other demon had a strength level similar to his own. Just then, a high orc walked past them. Hyun-suk quickly checked its battle power and was shocked to see it was over 14,000. That's when it hit him. Any demon with a battle power above 10,000 was at least at the commander level. After wandering around aimlessly for a while, Hyun-suk asked Rachel if she remembered anything about the opponent Commander Hemis had mentioned he'd need to fight in a few days. Unlike him, Rachel had all the details. Apparently, his opponent was a platoon leader named Kirkinor, with a brain supposedly dumber than a pig's. Hyun-suk felt a little hopeful. He thought that if he trained a bit more he might have a shot at beating a platoon leader. Surely Kirken couldn't have more than 3,000 battle strength, right? But just then Kirken himself started causing a scene just a few meters away, yelling his own name and acting like he truly had no brain. Out of curiosity, Hyun-suk quickly checked his power level, and to his horror, it was over 6,000. His jaw practically hit the ground, and his eyes went wide with shock. It felt like a death sentence to even think about fighting that monster. Right at that moment, the god system appeared out of thin air, confirming his fears but also giving him a quest. The quest was simple. He needed to raise his battle power to 3,000 within a week. Completing it would increase his chances of survival, and he'd also earn 300 hero points. The timing of the quest was perfect, snapping Hyunsuk out of his panic. It gave him a reason to focus and aim to get stronger. After all, in a week he'd only have two choices: win or die. But of course, Hyunsuk wasn't planning on dying anytime soon. Not before losing his virginity, at least. Without more explanation, the scene shifted to the next morning, where Hyunsuk was called to the kitchen, and he quickly showed up to find out why Kulkan wanted to see him. Before saying a word, Chef Kulkan noticed the boy's glasses and asked about them. Being a skilled liar, Hyunsuk casually replied that he had seen many others wearing the same thing, so he decided to get a pair for himself. Kulkan seemed to believe him and moved on, telling Hyunsuk to get ready for a big hunt that day. Before preparing for the hunt, Hyunsuk secretly measured Chef Kulkan's battle strength, only to discover that he was far stronger than anyone he had ever seen, except for Bobo. Curious, Hyunsuk turned to check the power levels of the other cooks in the kitchen. As he expected, most of them were stronger than him. Suddenly, an idea popped into his head. He thought that if he sparred with one of the cooks who had a similar skill level to his upcoming opponent Kirkin, he could learn more about how to fight him. Without hesitation, Hyunsuk rushed over to Chef Kulkan, bowed his head awkwardly, and politely asked if he could spar with one of the cooks. Kulkan was caught off guard by this sudden request, but immediately rejected it. On the other hand, Hyunsuk, being as persistent as ever, refused to give up. He explained that he wanted to get tougher and stronger through sparring. However, Chef Kulkan turned him down, dismissing the idea as a pointless hassle. To convince Hyunsuk to drop the idea, Chef Kulkan told him that, in his opinion, he was already strong enough for a human and didn't need to rush to get stronger. However, the boy wasn't ready to back down. As a last resort, he played his final card, threatening that he wouldn't give Kulkan a single bite of the meat he'd cook after the next hunt. That was the tipping point. Reluctantly, Chef Kulkan gave in and agreed to the sparring match. A short time later, as everyone gathered and wondered why they'd been called so early, the chatter began. Word spread quickly about a sparring match between Hyunsuk and someone called Golboksum. Some of the goblins seemed to tasted Hyunsuk's cooking, and because of that, kinda liked Hyunsuk himself, just like Chef Kulkan, while others whispered about whether today might be the day Hyunsuk met his end. Not far away, Hyunsuk stood face to face with Golboksum, a massive orc, at least twice his size, with a battle strength of over 2,600. Surprisingly, behind them, some goblins were plotting to kill Golboksum before the fight to save Hyunsuk. But Chef Kulkan quickly stopped them, as he had a different plan in mind. Soon after, the chef approached Golboksum and leaned in close, whispering a single instruction: don't kill Hyunsuk, no matter what. The orc seemed completely clueless, stupidly repeating Kulkan's words verbatim. At that moment, the chef realized his plan to use reasoning might not work with this pig-brained orc. Still, there wasn't much else he could do right now. Hyunsuk and Golboksum moved to the center of the area, while Chef Kulkan positioned himself between them, acting as the referee for the spar. Both fighters locked eyes. Hyunsuk looked determined to win, while poor Golboksum kept muttering to himself, "Don't kill Hyunsuk! Don't kill Hyunsuk!" And with that, Chef Kulkan announced the start of the sparring match. Hyunsuk was the first to make a move, dashing straight toward the massive orc. However, it was Golboksum who struck first, swinging a huge punch at the boy. Fortunately, Hyunsuk proved to be more agile. He swiftly dodged the punch, and spotting an opening, counterattacked to catch the orc completely off guard. At first, it looked like Hyunsuk was aiming to land a kick on the orc's lower body, but as an experienced MMA fighter, he was only pretending to target that spot. In a sudden, fluid motion, Hyunsuk shifted his aim and delivered a powerful kick straight to Golboksum's head. To everyone's shock, and even to Hyunsuk's own surprise, that single kick to the head was enough to knock the towering orc flat on the ground. This easy victory made Hyunsuk think that, despite the difference in their power levels, maybe he'd really have a chance to win against his crazy opponent, Kirkin. With the sparring finally settled, the focus shifted to the northern part of the dark forest, where the demons had gathered for the hunt. Hyunsuk was riding the high of his victory, overwhelmed by the incredible feeling of winning his battle. He started to believe that all those fancy battle strength numbers were just that, numbers, and nothing was set in stone. Suddenly, an ugly goblin appeared out of nowhere and reported that a large number of Talas were heading in their direction. Chef Kulkan's expression darkened immediately, acting like he clearly didn't like the sound of this news. Unfamiliar with what Talas were, Hyunsuk assumed Kulkan didn't want to deal with them simply because their meat probably wasn't tasty, but that wasn't the reason at all. As someone with plenty of experience, Kulkan explained that their meat, and especially the marrow from their bones, was actually a delicacy. The problem, however, was much bigger than that. Talas were spider-like creatures with skull-shaped bodies, and they lived in large groups. If you killed even one of them, the rest would come swarming for revenge, causing a huge amount of trouble for everyone. Chef Kilkan was deep in thought, trying to figure out what they should do next, while Hyunsuk was secretly hoping they'd just cancel the hunt and head back to the castle right away. However, the thought of how delicious Tao's meat was convinced Kilkan to take the risk. He gave the order for everyone to prepare for a tough battle. Not long after, the hunt, or more accurately, the battle, began. At first, the goblins outnumbered the Talas and started to hunt them down one by one. Same as usual, Hyunsuk showed up at the last second before killing one prey, pretending it was just a coincidence, and stole the kill with a final blow. The boy knew he needed to use this opportunity to level up as much as possible, and so he did. In less than an hour, they had slaughtered every single Talas in the area and piled their corpses in a random spot. Only one was left, and Hyunsuk made it his personal mission to finish it off. Laughing and enjoying the hunt more than anyone else, the boy felt proud of himself for managing to steal so many kills and level up significantly. He realized he kind of enjoyed butchering wild creatures like these, which was probably why he liked working in the kitchen so much. But his happy moment didn't last long. A sudden shout from the goblins disrupted everything. They were yelling that the queen of the Talas was here, urging everyone to prepare for the main battle. The enormous queen stood in the distance, completely still, her rage building with every passing second as she stared at the scene of her precious children brutally slaughtered for no reason. Just as the queen seemed on the verge of losing control, Hyunsuk decided to use his glasses to check how powerful she really was. To his shock, the glasses couldn't measure the queen's battle strength at all. The queen let out an ear-piercing scream, shaking the entire area. That was the moment Hyunsuk realized they were completely screwed. The boy decided to check what Kulkan wanted them to do as their captain, but when he turned to ask for orders, he saw Kulkan had abandoned all of them and was running as fast as he could. To do a favor, Kulkan only decided to shout back at his underlings to do whatever they could to survive. Hyunsuk didn't expect Chef Kulkan to be so irresponsible, but before he could dwell on it, something shifted his focus. It was the sound of goblins behind him, scattering aimlessly in panic before the Queen of Talas could catch them. Just like how the goblins had mercilessly hunted her children, the queen was now hunting them down one by one, her eyes blazing with anger and rage. Her movements radiated fury, and once again she let out a deafening scream, a scream so loud it could probably be heard miles away. Hyunsuk clutched his ears in desperation, wondering what kind of spider could make a sound like that. Right then, Rachel urged him to take a quick look behind him. That's when he realized everyone else had already taken off, running for their lives, and he was the only one still frozen in place. The Queen of Talas, along with an army of her children, was now just a few meters away, ready to catch him, and probably tear him apart. Thanks to Rachel, the boy finally realized he needed to get out of there as fast as possible, so he started running like crazy. He was fast enough to overtake all the goblins, but unfortunately for them, most ended up as a tasty snack for the Talases. While running, Hyunsuk kept glancing back every now and then to check the distance between him and the Talases. Each time he looked, it became clear that even a moment of hesitation would mean sharing the same fate as those poor goblins. After what felt like an eternity, Hyunsuk found himself standing in front of a massive cave, panting and completely exhausted. He hesitated, wondering if it was safe to go inside, doubting whether it might hold something even more dangerous. Rachel, trying her best to gain his trust, assured him that she was confident there was nothing dangerous inside the cave. Hyunsuk wasn't entirely convinced, but given the circumstances, he decided to trust her and do as she says, at least for this once. After all, the cave seemed much safer than the forest, where hundreds of Talases were hunting him. Cautiously, he stepped inside, moving slowly through the dark pathway while trying to get a sense of the cave's situation. As he walked, Rachel casually mentioned something that made Hyunsuk's eyes widen. She said the cave was so big that even the Queen of Talas could easily live a long life inside it. He quickly laughed it off, claiming it was just a joke and that it would never happen. But that one comment was enough to make Hyunsuk more alert. He started looking around nervously, only to spot something green on the cave wall. Curious but also worried, the boy moved closer and touched it, only to realize it felt like fresh spider poop, or something disgusting and sticky same as it. When he looked further into the cave, he realized that wasn't the only poop around. The place was covered in green, slimy droppings, massive spiderwebs, and what looked like eggs. That's when it hit him. This had to be one of the Tala's nests. Hyunsuk froze, his mind racing as he tried to figure out what to do. Should he get out of there and head back to the forest, or try to hide in a corner and hope for the best? As if to speed up his decision, a pair of glowing eyes appeared in the darkness, staring straight at him. In that moment, Hyunsuk knew exactly what he had to do. Run. Without wasting a second, he turned and bolted as fast as his legs could carry him. Behind him, the creature, a fully grown Talas, just like the queen, started chasing him. Hyunsuk ran aimlessly, not caring where he was going. All he wanted was to avoid getting caught. But as he was talking to Rachel in panic, he got distracted and accidentally stepped on a patch of slimy Talas poop. His foot slipped, and before he knew it, he was crashing hard onto the ground. The cornered boy found himself in a life-or-death situation and decided to use whatever he could find around him to defend himself. Without thinking much, he grabbed one of the Tala's eggs and threw it at her, not even realizing what he had just thrown. To his surprise, the full-grown Talus jumped in the egg's path on purpose. She even used her small boobs as something like car's airbag only to protect the egg. That ugly monster acted like a real mom, visibly shaking and feeling relieved to see her child was unharmed. Hyunsuk, clueless as ever, stood there confused. He couldn't understand why the Talus had suddenly stopped attacking him and why she seemed so concerned about whatever it was he had thrown. He asked Rachel if she had any idea, but her response was even more ridiculous than his thoughts. She confidently declared, "Maybe she likes what you threw at her because it's round, smooth, and moist." Hyunsuk sighed at Rachel's useless input, then turned his gaze to take a closer look at an object similar to the one he had thrown. That's when it hit him. These were her eggs. That explained why she was so protective and cared so much about them. Realizing he could use the mother's love to his advantage, Hyunsuk picked up another one of her large eggs. A mischievous grin spread across his face as he prepared to mess with the ugly but strangely kind monster mob. Seeing her egg in the boy's hand, the Talus started trembling, clearly terrified he might harm her precious child. But the boy didn't give two flying fuck about her feelings. He took the stance of a pro baseball player and hurled the egg as fast as he could. To his surprise, the Talus moved faster than he expected and caught the egg mid-air. Rachel, looking unusually calm, decided to play along and pretended to be a sports commentator, narrating the match between Hyunsuk and the full-grown Talus. On the other hand, what started as a terrified boy now turned into a bully, as Hyunsuk began throwing the Talus's eggs one by one. With more than 100 eggs scattered around him, he was determined to have his fun at the poor mother Talus' expense for a while. A few minutes later, the Talus was visibly defeated, having failed to save 99% of her eggs, all while Hyunsuk mocked her relentlessly for her failure. Feeling cocky, he turned to Rachel and casually asked her to hand him another egg. But Rachel, trying not to laugh, replied that there were no more left, stating he had already smashed every single egg around them. Hyunsuk froze. He had been so caught up in his amusement at tormenting the Talus that he hadn't noticed just how many eggs he had destroyed. That was the moment the boy realized he was in big trouble. But with nothing left to hold her back, the Talus let out a scream that sounded like a furious dog and charged straight at Hyunsuk, determined to get sweet revenge for her beloved children. Strangely, this time, Hyunsuk didn't even try to run. Instead, he calmly asked Rachel to quickly cast an enhancement buff on him. The enraged Talus was only a few meters away, ready to pounce and tear him apart when Rachel finally cast her basic buff on him, nervously announcing that it was the best she could manage right now. The Talus lunged forward, but little did she know, Hyunsuk had already found the courage to face her head-on. With Rachel's enhancement buff and his own ability, Hyunsuk moved with lightning speed, landing a powerful punch directly on the Talus's lower body. The force of his punch was so strong that it added a new hole right through her, right before she could even think of turning him into human stew. That single strike was enough to kill the Talus instantly. As a bonus, Hyunsuk leveled up 3 times in one go because of the kill. Hyunsuk stood there, stunned. He couldn't believe it. He had taken down that ugly giant monster with just one punch. For a moment, he just stared at his own hand, amazed by what he had done. Then Rachel rushed over from behind, suddenly acting all concerned about his safety. Hyunsuk, exhausted and panting, like he'd been the one taking the beating, turned to Rachel and told her to find a better place to rest. Soon, they came across a peaceful spot where they could take a break. While Hyunsuk sat down to catch his breath, Rachel fussed over him, trying her best to heal his hand, which had gotten injured from the powerful punch. Meanwhile, Hyunsuk took this chance to use the 8 hero points he had earned today, spreading them evenly across his stats. He felt great watching all his stats grow at the same time, looking more balanced now. Just then, a voice called out from the darkness. "Is that you, Hyunsuk?" It immediately caught his attention. Hyunsuk turned to see who was calling him, only to spot a huge shadow slowly approaching. To his surprise, it was Chef Kulkan, appearing out of nowhere and acting like nothing had happened. Hyunsuk, however, wasn't thrilled to see him. After all, Kulkan had betrayed and abandoned all of them, and now here he was, acting all friendly. Besides that, the boy couldn't help but wonder how the chef even got here. According to the chef, it looked like the same thing that happened to Hyunsuk had happened to him as well, declaring he stumbled upon this place while trying to hide from Talas' army. Of course, Kulkan was feeling lucky about being able to find a hiding spot and seeing Hyunsuk at the same time. Not wanting to let Kulkan ruin his mood any further, Hyunsuk quickly pointed out that this cave was actually the nest of Talas. He mentioned, in no uncertain terms, that there were hundreds of Talas eggs scattered all over the place. To drive his point home, Hyunsuk even suggested that it'd be a good idea for both of them to leave the cave immediately. Chef Kulkan's eyes widened in shock, but then his demeanor completely changed to appreciate the food, much like when Hyunsuk fed Bobo. Kulkan grabbed a Tao's egg in his hand, announcing with excitement that this was the first time he'd had the chance to get a closer look at such a rare and incredibly delicious food, something only the highest-level demons could ever dream of tasting. Seeing his reaction, Hyunsuk became furious. He stood up and started yelling at the chef, reminding him that they needed to get out of the cave immediately without wasting any time. On the other hand, Chef Kulkan acted completely carefree, all because he believed that the swarm of Talas that had been chasing him had already tracked him to the cave, leaving no way for them to escape. Having already given up on his life, Kulkan just wanted to enjoy the Tala's egg as his last meal. Just then, the sound of chattering echoed from a little further inside the cave. It was a group of the few remaining goblins who had accidentally wandered in. Without even apologizing for abandoning them earlier, Kulkan casually invited the goblins to join him for what he called their last meal before they died. Kulkan's words started to get to Hyunsuk too, making him wonder if this really was going to be his last meal. But then another thought struck him. He was still a virgin, and the idea of dying a second time without at least experiencing life with his future wife felt unbearable. This realization sparked a fire in him. Hyunsuk decided right then and there that he would do whatever it took to survive and get everyone out of this nerved place alive. Meanwhile, inside Commander Hemi's office, Reedrun had just returned from a mission and came to report to her. As usual, Hemi was lounging in her chair. She first asked Reedrun why he was acting so formal again, and then got straight to the point, asking if he had completed the mission she assigned him. The cow-headed orc replied that he had successfully captured the Saintess of the Holy Empire, just as she instructed. Commander Hemis jumped out of her seat and approached him. Praising Reedrun for his excellent work, she admitted she didn't expect him to finish the mission in just 3 weeks. Proud of him, she gently patted his head, making him blush furiously, his face turning from red to an intense shade of crimson. Just as she was about to make a move on him, Hemis, ever the sharp demon, sensed someone lurking outside her office, trying to interrupt her moment. It turned out to be a goblin who nervously stepped into her office after her warning. He stammered that something urgent had happened. He explained, his voice trembling, that the cooks had gone out hunting for resources, but ran into an unexpected disaster. Annoyed that her time was being wasted over what seemed like a trivial issue, Hemis demanded to know what the so-called emergency was about. The goblin then revealed the full story. It involved the Queen of Talas, a deadly encounter, and most of the group being killed, with a few still missing. Both Commander Hemis and Reedrun froze in shock, realizing just how urgent the situation really was. While Hemis didn't actually care much about anyone, Reedrun was deeply worried about Hyunsuk. He quickly asked the goblin if he knew what had happened to him, but the goblin had no solid information. He couldn't say if Hyunsuk was alive or not. The cow-headed orc fell silent, his mind racing, wondering if the boy was still alive or had ended up as a snack for the Talas Queen. Meanwhile, back inside the cave, Chef Kulkan was having the time of his life, watching the goblins guzzle down Talas eggs like it was their last legendary feast. Hyunsuk, on the other hand, couldn't stand the sight. Without warning, he grabbed something heavy and smashed it onto Kulkan's head, yelling at him to pull himself together and not give up. Kulkan turned to glare at Hyunsuk, completely stunned that the boy had dared to hit him. Confused, he demanded to know what that was all about, only to spot a large book in Hyunsuk's hands. Looking more serious than ever, Hyunsuk explained that he felt like Kulkan had fallen under some kind of wicked spell, and he had no choice but to use his secret weapon to snap him out of it. That secret weapon turned out to be an encyclopedia packed with information about demonic beasts, a book Hyunsuk had recently bought, not only to bring Kulkan back to his senses, but also to gather critical information about the Talas creature. According to the encyclopedia, Talases are spider-like demonic beasts that live in large groups. One of their key features is their particularly sturdy legs. To kill them, the best method is to target their heads and torsos, and here's the kicker. Their bodily fluids are extremely flammable, and even their eggs contain a liquid as combustible as a bomb. Hyunsuk read all of this information aloud to everyone, which sparked an idea in his head. He turned to Chef Kulkan and asked if by any chance he could use fire magic. Kulkan, confused by the sudden question, still replied that he could manage basic fire magic, like shooting small flames. However, Kulkan, already resigned to their fate, dismissed Hyunsuk's efforts, telling him to give up just like he had. He even reminded the boy that his fire magic wouldn't stand a chance against any of Talas's. Frustrated and disappointed that Kulkan thought he was being foolish, Hyunsuk declared that his plan wasn't as simple as it seemed. Without warning, he started shouting to grab everyone's attention, determined to share his plan for escaping and surviving. To get them to listen and cooperate, Hyunsuk held up a Talas egg in his hand and confidently declared that if they managed to escape, they could always return later to enjoy this delicious food. However, the first step of Hyunsuk's plan failed because everyone was already stuffed with talus eggs, so they didn't find his offer motivating enough to take action. But the boy had a backup plan. He promised that if they managed to escape, he would serve them unlimited gourmet demonic beast meat as a survival celebration. Unlike his first offer, this one completely changed the goblins' minds. They suddenly became interested in living and escaping this doomed place. Out of nowhere, Chef Kulkan approached Hyunsuk and placed a hand on his shoulder. His face lit up with the same excitement he had when he first saw the talus eggs. Kulkan was ready to cooperate, if it meant getting to eat whatever the boy would cook later. Hyunsuk was shocked to see the once hopeless chef, who had given up on life, change his expression so quickly. Minutes later, when everyone was mentally prepared, Hyunsuk began explaining the plan. The first part was simple. They had to run as fast as they could, follow his lead, and not stop under any circumstances. With that, Hyunsuk took off, running swiftly and determined to make it out alive. Behind him, a total of 7 goblins, each a different color, along with Chef Kukan, followed closely. Each of them carried 2 talus eggs in their hands, clutching them as if their lives depended on it. As soon as they left their hideout, they were immediately confronted by a swarm of taluses, some fully grown, but most of them smaller offspring. Chef Kulkan began summoning his fire magic, just as Hyunsuk had instructed. Then, without hesitation, the boy lit one of the taluses' eggs on fire and hurled it with all his strength. Surprisingly, though, he didn't target the taluses directly. The egg exploded on impact, creating a fiery blast that instantly caught the attention of the taluses. All at once, the ugly spider-like creatures rushed toward the explosion, doing everything they could to stop the fire from spreading. Hyunsuk let out a sigh of relief when he saw his plan working, knowing that the fully grown taluses would prioritize extinguishing the fire to protect their nest and the rest of their eggs. Taking advantage of the distraction, Hyunsuk found an opening and bolted forward, yelling at the others to follow him. As they ran, they used most of the remaining eggs as makeshift bombs to keep the taluses occupied. Unfortunately, along the way, many of their group were caught by the relentless creatures, and there was no way to save them. Hyunsuk had no choice but to keep moving, his focus locked on survival. Eventually, they were down to just 1 egg, and Hyunsuk was desperately searching for a way out of the cursed cave. Just when things seemed hopeless, Rachel stepped up and pointed out the exit to him. But before he could fully celebrate, disaster struck. Hyunsuk, distracted while talking to the others, was wounded by one of the taluses. Despite the injury, he refused to stop. Gritting his teeth and pushing through the pain, he motivated himself with a rather unconventional thought, dreaming about having babies with Commander Hemis. That bizarre but oddly effective determination kept him moving forward, determined to make it out alive. Somehow they managed to escape from the swarm of taluses, but only 4 of them were left alive. Seeing the exit up ahead and the faint rays of sunlight shining through filled Hyunsuk with relief and excitement. For a moment, he thought they had made it out alive and they were finally safe, but as he got a clearer look, he froze in his tracks. There was the exit, sure, but the Queen Talus herself was blocking the way. Hyunsuk couldn't help but compare her to the others. The full-grown taluses they had faced earlier were like harmless rabbits compared to this monstrous bear. The sheer size of the queen and her ferocious appearance made both Hyunsuk and Chef Kulkan question if this was the end of their journey. To make things worse, the distant sound of the other taluses closing in echoed through the cave, adding even more pressure to the situation. Hyunsuk clenched the last remaining egg tightly in his fist, his mind racing for a plan. The Queen Talus locked her eyes on him, clearly enraged by the sight of him gripping the egg so tightly it was almost cracking. Chef Kulkan, on the other hand, sank back into despair. He muttered that trying to escape in the first place had been pointless, but Hyunsuk refused to give up. He had already noticed something important. The queen hadn't attacked them yet, even after spotting them. It didn't take long for him to figure out why. She wasn't attacking because of the egg in his hand. With this realization, Hyunsuk acted quickly. In a sudden move, he tore off one of his sleeves, shouting loudly to grab the Queen Tala's full attention. At the same time, he turned to Kulkanat and urgently asked him to light up the piece of cloth. His voice was steady, his eyes determined. Hyunsuk wasn't giving up without a fight. Kulkan stood frozen, completely shocked, wondering what Hyunsuk was up to. Still, he decided to follow Hyunsuk's lead without asking any questions. To threaten the queen, and as if the queen could even understand what Hyunsuk was saying, the boy lifted the egg as high as he could. Then, he brought the burning cloth closer to the egg, loudly declaring that it was the last remaining egg out of hundreds that had once been in the cave. He made it crystal clear. If she didn't step aside and let them go, he would use the egg as a bomb. He warned her that he'd make the cave collapse, killing all of her precious offspring before she could do any harm to them. The queen didn't take it well. She either didn't understand what Hyunsuk was saying or simply didn't care to cooperate. In response, she let out a scream but didn't budge an inch. Hyunsuk wasn't backing down. He repeated his threat, insisting he wasn't bluffing. But still, the queen refused to give in. She just stood her ground, glaring at him with an unrelenting rage. Truthfully, Hyunsuk was bluffing. He knew one egg couldn't possibly destroy the entire cave, but with no other options on the table, he decided to take his chances. He lit the egg on fire and with all his strength hurled it deep into the cave. What happened next was nothing short of bizarre. The egg hit one of the cave's main pillars and exploded. To everyone's surprise, the explosion caused some cracks that immediately began spreading across the cave like wildfire. Before long, cracks spread all across the cave, and the ground began to shake as if an earthquake was about to tear everything apart. Goblins were the first to notice the danger, quickly realizing how serious the situation was. Moments later, Hyunsuk also realized that the cave really was collapsing, just like the bluff he had made earlier to scare the queen. Without wasting any time, Hyunsuk started running and yelled for the others to do the same, hoping they could escape past the queen's massive body before the entire cave came crashing down. Meanwhile, more Talases arrived, either trying to save themselves or still determined to chase after Hyunsuk and his group. Out of nowhere, a massive stone fell from above, crushing one of the Talases that had been chasing Hyunsuk. The creature was instantly killed. Hyunsuk froze in his tracks as a strange sensation washed over him. He had leveled up. He stood there, stunned, trying to figure out why he leveled up when he hadn't even landed the killing blow. Rachel, on the other hand, was doing everything she could to snap him out of it. She grabbed his hair and shouted at him, trying to pull him toward the exit. "Wake up, Hyunsuk! Move!" she screamed, desperate to get him to realize the danger they were in. But something even stranger happened. Right in front of him, another gigantic rock came crashing down, this time on another fully grown talus. The creature was killed instantly, and once again, Hyunsuk leveled up without lifting a finger. As the collapse sped up, shaking the deeper parts of the cave, the boy's experience points seemed to skyrocket. He began leveling up again and again, so quickly that he couldn't even keep count of how many times it happened. Each kill caused by the falling rocks seemed to send a surge of energy through him, and he was mesmerized by the phenomenon. By this point, everyone else had already dashed past him, racing toward the exit. Hyunsuk, however, was still standing there, completely captivated by the endless stream of level-ups. He was so overwhelmed by it all that he failed to realize the obvious. If he didn't keep moving, he'd be the next victim of the collapsing cave. Slowly, everything started to make sense to him. The shocked boy realized he was gaining these kill experiences because he was the one who caused the cave to collapse. Finally, Hyunsuk decided to run outside before meeting the same fate as those ugly spiders. To make it out alive, and of course increase his chance of success, the boy asked Rachel to use a speed-enhancing buff on him, and so she did. The fact that he managed to survive all this chaos warmed his heart, but the biggest problem was figuring out how to avoid the Talus Queen before cave completely collapsed. The only idea that came to his mind was he needed to somehow distract the queen for just a moment. If he could pull that off, all of them might have a chance to escape. Just then, his eyes caught something. It was Chef Kulkan, trying to offer a talus egg and asking the queen to let them go in exchange for it. It seemed Kulkan had been hiding the egg for another time, but now he was giving it up to buy his life and freedom. However, that wasn't the case. Chef Kulkan was actually sacrificing his food, and above that, his life, to buy Hyunsuk a little time to escape. Unlike before, when the queen hesitated against Hyunsuk while he held her egg, this time she didn't pause for more than seconds before stabbing Kulkan with her sharp leg, killing that brave guy without mercy. Hyunsuk was shocked, watching the scene as he kept running. He couldn't do anything to stop it, but he swore to himself to do his best to escape in order to not let Kulkan's death be in vain. With the queen already finished with the goblins and Kulkan, she had one person left to take revenge on for the massacre of her offspring. Before she could find the boy, Hyunsuk spotted an opening between her legs. Without wasting a second, the boy ran as fast as he could and managed to slip under the queen's massive body, hoping to pass unnoticed. However, the distracted Talas queen quickly realized what was happening. Instead of using her big butt like the other spiders, she spit green webs straight out of her mouth, aiming to catch him. Unfortunately, she managed to grab hold of Hyunsuk's hand before he could fully escape. Hyunsuk hadn't expected to get caught, and the moment it happened, he felt a sinking realization, like it was the end of his short journey in this second life. As the queen prepared to finish him off, someone suddenly entered the scene and stopped her attack in a few inches before hitting the protagonist. To Hyunsuk's shock, it was Reborn. Out of nowhere, the cow-headed orc appeared, seemingly so worried that personally came all the way here to save the main character's little sorry ass at the perfect time. Hyunsuk was stunned, as he had expected anything but being rescued by Reborn. With a grin on his face, Reborn said he knew Hyunsuk wouldn't die so easily, and he was glad to see him still alive. He told Hyunsuk to relax and assured him that he would handle things from here. On the other side, although the queen still had 7 other legs to fight with, she seemed completely stuck and overpowered. Against Reborn, she couldn't even move an inch. In a sudden move, Reborn unleashed his overwhelming power, breaking the queen's leg into pieces, with cracks spreading all over it. The tallest queen let out an ear-piercing scream, overwhelmed by the unbearable pain. That scary and unstoppable monster just a moment ago was acting like she was on the verge of being completely defeated. A little farther away, Reedrun stood in front of Hyunsuk like a total badass daddy protector. His stance and the powerful aura around him made Hyunsuk think of him as nothing less than his absolutely fucking awesome hero. What had started as a day that seemed peaceful ended with only 6 survivors out of the original 105 kitchen members. Back inside the castle, Hyunsuk lay sprawled on the ground, completely drained, while Bobo sat on top of him. Now much bigger than before, Bobo whimpered and whined, clearly upset that Hyunsuk had left him alone for so long. Exhausted, Hyunsuk simply let Bobo do whatever he wanted to show his excitement at being reunited. Meanwhile, Rachel stood at a safe distance, watching the two. She remarked on how lucky they were to have escaped that nightmare, all thanks to Reedrun's help. Hyunsuk agreed, but only partially. He reminded Rachel that in just a few days, he would have to face a towering orc with a battle strength of 6,000, a fight he believed would be his certain death. Unlike the hopeless Hyunsuk, Rachel didn't see it that way. She confidently reminded him that he had grown much stronger in just a single day, and there was no reason to think he couldn't survive against his brainless opponent. Her optimism in him was unwavering, even though Hyunsuk still doubted himself. According to Hyunsuk's status window, he had gained 75 levels in one go thanks to the cave's collapse. Now, he was exactly at level 200. His battle strength had more than doubled in just a single day. But even with that boost, both of them knew it was still only half of his opponent's battle power. That's when Rachel asked a curious question. Would you gain orc-like strength if you reach 6,000 battle strength? The boy wasn't sure what Rachel meant by that, so he simply replied that it likely depended on other factors as well, not just the numbers. Rachel had asked the question to come to the conclusion that for a Hyunsuk to win his upcoming fight, except his physical strength, he would need to use magic too, as it gives him a better chance of victory in her opinion. Hyunsuk, however, wasn't exactly familiar with magic and thought it was easier said than done. The fairy girl, trying to help him understand, declared that Hyunsuk had already used magic before, specifically during the moment he dashed toward that full-grown talus and finished it off in one strike. On the other hand, Hyunsuk had no idea what she was talking about. He didn't even know if he'd ever used magic before. But Rachel's words stuck with him and made him think harder. Slowly, he began to wonder if that sudden surge of power he had felt in his body at that critical moment was in fact the magic Rachel was referring to. Before they could come to any conclusion, the door creaked open and Reedrun stepped into Bobo's room, scaring both of them to their cores. Rachel quickly vanished into thin air to avoid getting caught, while Hyunsuk awkwardly asked what brought Reedrun to such a lowly place. The once normal cow-headed orc's expression suddenly shifted, and in a firm, commanding tone, he declared that Hyunsuk needed to follow him to meet Commander Hemis. Moments or maybe minutes later, they arrived at Hemis's office after receiving her permission to enter. She looked surprised to see Reedrun there, especially since he described his visit as something personal. She couldn't help but wonder what this was all about. Reedrun responded politely, asking for Hemis's permission to personally train Hyunsuk in the art of battle, something Hyunsuk himself hadn't expected to hear. This request made Hemis even more curious, as she wanted to know why Reedrun, of all people, was so willing to personally train a human. Reedrun's reason was simple. He knew Hyunsuk's opponent was way stronger than him, and since he kind of liked Hyunsuk, he didn't want to let him die so easily. Reedrun had seen something in that boy that caught his attention. His potential. It was enough to make Reedrun want to personally ensure his success in the future. Hyunsuk was completely stunned. He could only stare at Reedrun in awe, thinking there was no way Commander Hemis would allow Reedrun to train him. But to his shock, she agreed without hesitation, probably because she cared about Reedrun so much that she couldn't say no to him. After giving them what they wanted, Hemis dismissed them, saying she had other matters to handle. They left as ordered, but just before stepping out, Hyunsuk turned back to express his gratitude for Commander Hemis' wise decision, as though he truly wanted to be trained by Reedrun. As they exited the room, a thought crossed Hemis's mind, and she could easily read Hyunsuk like an open book. She wondered how he had managed to grow more than twice as strong since the last time she saw him. It kinda amused her to meet someone who could grow so fast, but at the same time, it irritated her. Hemis knew that if Reedrun stepped in to train the boy, his victory would be almost certain. To make things more balanced, or perhaps out of spite for Hyunsuk's success, as someone who didn't want to see him win so easily decided to take action from the shadows. The orc, with his cow-like head, wasted no time dragging Hyunsuk to his personal training field. Hyunsuk, wide-eyed with curiosity, glanced around, wondering if Reedrun really used this massive space all by himself just to train. But while Hyunsuk was busy taking in the surroundings, Reedrun's attention was fixed squarely on him. As much as Hyunsuk was intrigued by the training ground, Reedrun was equally curious about the boy standing behind him. The orc could sense that Hyunsuk's body brimmed with an overwhelming amount of mana. Yet something was off. Why couldn't the boy properly channel such raw energy? Like Commander Hemeth, Reedrun had also noticed how much stronger Hyunsuk had grown in such a ridiculously short amount of time. It was almost impossible to ignore, no matter how goofy and unassuming the boy looked. Initially, Reedrun had planned to start with the basics, easing Hyunsuk into proper training, but there was no time for that now. With only 4 days remaining until Hyunsuk's big battle, the orc decided to skip the baby steps altogether. Out of nowhere, when Hyunsuk was completely lost in his usual, inappropriate, daydreaming thoughts, Reedrun suddenly spun around and threw a punch straight at his face. It wasn't out of anger, it was all part of the training. Hyunsuk, still caught up in his wandering mind, didn't even have time to react. The blow landed clean, snapping him back to reality. "Focus!" Reedrun barked, towering over him. Hyunsuk staggered back, clutching his face in both shock and fury. "What the hell was that for?" he shouted, glaring at the orc. His mind raced. Why was Reedrun beating me up for no reason, especially when he claimed he wanted to train me? The orc didn't give Hyunsuk any time to process what was happening. Before he could think, Reedrun launched another attack, this time shouting at him to learn how to block using mana. Hyunsuk scrambled to defend himself, and to his credit, he managed to block the incoming strike. But there was one problem. He only used his physical strength to do it. Even though he successfully stopped the attack, the sheer force of it sent him skidding several meters backward, his feet dragging through the ground. Reedrun, standing tall in front of him, couldn't help but feel a little weird about the whole thing. How had this guy managed to block my kick? The cow-headed orc didn't know it yet, that Hyunsuk had been a professional fighter in his previous life. To Reedrun, his reflexes, reaction time, and sharp vision were on a completely different level compared to any ordinary hero in this world. Reedrun's suspicions deepened as he observed Hyunsuk's fighting stance. The way he shifted so quickly from being shocked to looking deadly serious and ready for a fight was a dead giveaway. It all started to click. The orc realized that might explain why he hadn't been able to dodge Hyunsuk's kick back in the slave dormitory. This boy wasn't just some clueless, weakling hero. There was something exceptional about him. Fueled by this realization, Reedrun decided to push him harder. If Hyunsuk could handle more than he initially thought, then there was no point in holding back. The orc, like an enraged bull, charged forward with full force. He roared as he closed the distance, yelling at Hyunsuk to start using mana if he ever wanted to stand a chance against the orc Kurken. Without holding back, Reedrun lowered his head and used his massive, bull-like horns to slam into Hyunsuk with a crushing blow. The impact was brutal, sending the boy flying high into the air like a rag doll. Reedrun stood firm, his deep voice booming as he shouted, "I'd rather see you die here learning how to use mana than watch you get humiliated and defeated in front of everyone." While flying helplessly through the air, pain radiating through every inch of his body, Hyunsuk was absolutely sure of one thing. Reedrun wasn't joking around. The orc was either going to teach him how to fight properly or beat him to death trying. As that realization sank in, an absurd thought crept into Hyunsuk's perverted mind. The idea of dying a virgin again. The sheer embarrassment of leaving this world for a second time without, well, experiencing life properly, sparked a fire inside him. He swore to himself that he'd survive no matter what it took, so he could live to see his future bastard kids. Fueled by this ridiculous but oddly motivating thought, Hyunsuk gritted his teeth and resolved to pull mana out of himself no matter where it was hiding, even if it felt like it was buried somewhere deep in his ass. But Reedrun wasn't about to give him a moment to rest. The big, bull-headed orc leaped after him through the air, determined to keep the pressure on. This time, though, Hyunsuk wasn't going to just sit there and take a beating. Instead of waiting for the inevitable pain, he pushed himself off mid-air and launched back toward Reedrun. Whether it was an act of bravery, desperation, or sheer stupidity, even Hyunsuk didn't know. All he knew was that he was either going to take the orc down or go down swinging. And then, something incredible happened. As he clenched his fist, a faint blue aura started glowing around it. Hyunsuk was shocked, as it was something the boy himself had no idea how he did it, but he wasn't about to waste the opportunity. Just before their attacks collided, he sent a quick, frantic prayer to every god he could think of, pleading, "Please don't let me die as a virgin a second time." Their clash was explosive. It looked like a meteor had smashed into the ground. Dust and debris flew everywhere, and the shockwave rippled through the air. At first, it seemed like Hyunsuk had gained the upper hand. Or so it looked at first glance. The truth was far less glamorous. Hyunsuk was lying unconscious on the ground, battered and bruised, while Rachel frantically tried to shake him awake. The boy was out cold, his body completely spent. Reedrun, on the other hand, stood tall and unharmed, not a single scratch on him. He approached the fallen hero, his massive frame casting a shadow over the pair. Rachel, sensing danger, bolted before the orc could catch her. Looking at Hyunsuk, Reedrun smirked and said happily, "Congratulations, you finally managed to use mana. There was a hint of approval in his tone. Hyun-suk, barely clinging to consciousness, cracked open one eye. With a shaky arm, he raised his trembling hand into the air. Slowly, he formed his fingers into a weak but determined thumbs up. Whether it was aimed at Reed-run, the gods, or just himself for managing to survive, even he wasn't sure. But one thing was clear. He'd been given another chance to keep fighting, and maybe, just maybe, to see a better tomorrow. The cow-headed orc Reed-run felt a wave of relief wash over him, as he realized Hyun-suk might actually have a shot at winning now. Without hesitation, he reached out and grabbed the boy's hand. "Stay still," Reed-run said firmly, then gripping Hyun-suk's hand tightly, declared, "Let me heal your injuries." But the moment Reed-run began using his healing magic, something went terribly wrong. Almost instantly, Hyun-suk felt like his entire body was being ripped apart from the inside. Every muscle screamed in pain, his lungs felt like they were being crushed, and he couldn't even draw a proper breath. It was as if someone was choking the life out of him. Reed-run froze, wide-eyed as he watched Hyun-suk writhe in agony. Realization hit him like a hammer to the chest that he had made a grave mistake. He had forgotten a crucial fact. Demons like him use dark mana for their magic, and for humans, dark mana was nothing short of a deadly poison. Cursing himself under his breath for being so careless, Reed-run quickly stopped the spell. Without wasting another second, he scooped up Hyun-suk's limp, lifeless body and started running. As he sprinted toward safety, a rare sense of guilt settled in his chest. "Forgive me, kid," he murmured. "I didn't mean for this to happen. Just hang on a little longer." Before anything else, let's take a moment to understand what's happening here with a quick tutorial. In this world, there are three primary forces that govern all magic and power: dark mana, regular mana, and divine power. Each of them counters another, creating a balance of sorts. Dark mana counters regular mana, mana counters divine power counters dark mana. Here's how it works. Mana is the natural energy that humans use. Dark mana, on the other hand, belongs to demons and is infused with corruption, making it inherently dangerous to humans. And finally, divine power is reserved for those who worship the gods, and is a natural enemy to dark mana. This world was once a place of peace, where people lived their lives without fear or conflict. But that tranquility didn't last. One day, the Church of Teosis, known for having the largest congregation across the land, sparked a devastating religious war. Their goal was singular and ruthless, to bring every other religion under their control. By the time the bloodshed ceased, the Church of Teosis had emerged victorious, consolidating their power and rebranding themselves as the Divine Empire. Gatrin's influence spread like wildfire, and their claim to divine authority was absolute. One day, they discovered someone who claimed to hear the voice of God. Wasting no time, the church exalted her as their saintess, a holy figure to be revered by all. Now, let's shift focus to the present. A silver-haired girl sat quietly in her dimly lit room, her sharp ears picking up the hushed voices of two individuals in the corridor. They were deep in conversation, as they were talking about the saintess. About her. Her name was Abelson Maria, and she was the newly chosen saintess of the Divine Empire. It was unusual company for her to overhear, though. The muffled voices belonged to a pair of goblins, of all things. They were whispering to each other, questioning if the girl in the room next door was really a saintess. One of them wondered aloud why she hadn't prayed in several days, while the other doubted whether someone like her could truly be divine. But despite the goblins' doubts and their remarks, Abelson herself had an entirely different perspective. Yes, she was a saintess, or at least that's what the church had told her. Saintesses were supposed to be able to communicate with God, to hear his voice and act as his vessel. But to Abelson, there was no point in praying to a god she couldn't even believe in anymore. She saw no meaning in the endless rituals and hollow sermons. In fact, deep down, she'd rather be right here, imprisoned in demon territory, than return to that cursed church, where her life felt like nothing more than an illusion. Just then, the door burst open without warning. It was Reed-run, the cow-headed orc. His steps were heavy, his expression grim, and in his arms he was cradling the lifeless body of Hyun-suk. Without wasting a moment, Reed-run locked eyes with Abelson and barked, "Saintess, I need your help!" On the other hand, Abelson found it disrespectful for a man to suddenly enter her room while she was there as a woman. However, Reed-run insisted it was an emergency and that she needed to heal the guy before it was too late. A while later, deep in his subconscious, Hyun-suk felt like he was drowning in eternal darkness, wondering what that red cow-headed orc had done to make him feel this way. Then he noticed a soft hand holding his hand. He was sure it couldn't be Reed-run's rough, manly hand, and started wondering if it was Rachel's. Soon, Hyun-suk regained consciousness, and the first thing he saw was a silver-haired girl. He immediately assumed he must have died again, and now another angel had come to greet him. Even though he was awake, he seemed a bit out of his mind, blaming Rachel for his short second life and swearing he would never forgive her. Saintess Abelson watched him, confused, as Hyun-suk kept ranting about Rachel, calling her a devil disguised as an angel and begging God to send her to eternal hell. Assuming he'd eventually be reincarnated as a hero again, Hyun-suk, with semi-conscious appearance, asked the Saintess to marry him, saying it was the only way he'd agree to play the role of a hero again. It didn't take long for him to realize he wasn't dead, and definitely wasn't talking to an angel, especially after Abelson called him a disgusting, pathetic fool, which pretty much confirmed it. Hyun-suk looked even more confused, glancing around to figure out who he had been talking to this whole time. Before he could process anything, Reedrun grabbed him by the collar and hugged him so tightly it felt like his bones might break, clearly overjoyed that Hyun-suk was okay. Squished in Reedrun's iron grip, Hyun-suk couldn't help but wonder what was going on and, more importantly, why he wasn't dead. As he tried to get a better look at Saintess Abelson, it finally hit him. He had been rambling all that nonsense in front of an actual person. Reedrun, still looking worried, turned to Abelson and asked if Hyun-suk was completely free of the dark mana. She shook her head and replied, not fully. Meanwhile, Hyun-suk was crying internally and regretting his earlier behavior, especially after hearing the Saintess explain that the dark mana wouldn't leave his body so easily. Reedrun, unable to hold back, asked Abelson why she couldn't remove all of it, even though she possessed divine powers. In response, Abelson calmly declared that she could, but if something went wrong, Hyun-suk would actually die for real this time. However, she also added that the dark mana would gradually fade on its own over time, so there wasn't much to worry about. To make up for his mistake and the pain Hyun-suk was going through because of him, Reedrun decided to take the boy back to the training field and teach him something actually useful this time. When the Saintess overheard Reedrun talking about training, her curiosity was immediately piqued. She couldn't help but wonder who this human was that was being trained by a high-level demon. Hours later, Bobo was holding a beaten and bruised Hyun-suk by the head, playfully tugging at him like a toy. From what Hyun-suk had heard earlier, Bobo apparently ate every soldier who came to feed it today and also managed to destroy its house in just half a day when Hyun-suk wasn't around to watch over it. Despite everything, Hyun-suk still found the strength to thank Bobo because, if it wasn't for that crazy doggo, Reedrun wouldn't have let him off the hook without training him to the brink of death. Hyun-suk was torn, partly happy to have been trained but mostly miserable from everything he endured today, especially with the dark mana still moving freely inside his body, making everything worse. Completely exhausted and with no energy left to even stand, Hyun-suk turned to Rachel, hoping to ask if the dark mana might eventually kill him or something. But before he could get an answer, he found out there's something wrong with Rachel. Rachel was sitting in a corner, crying like a 2-year-old girl, complaining to her god about how her hero was once again ruined and corrupted, just when she thought things were finally looking hopeful. After what felt like forever of Rachel crying like the world was ending, she finally started to calm down. She took a shaky breath, then started spilling everything. How every bad thing happening to Hyun-suk was all on her, the dark mana messing him up, the times he nearly died, and, of course, the fact that he's stuck in this world alongside her. She whispered to herself, "It's because I'm just a demon pretending to be an angel, a total psycho who probably deserves to burn in hell forever." Hyun-suk froze, his brain grinding to a halt. Those were the exact words he'd thrown at the Saintess when he woke up that time. Words he never thought would come back to bite him like this. And now he'd just stepped on the emotional bomb of the century. His heart raced as he scrambled to fix it. "You're not a psycho. You're like, I don't know, the best buff item in this whole world. I'm serious." "Shut up," she snapped, her voice trembling with frustration. "I know you don't mean that." Hyun-suk just sat there, totally lost for words. He fidgeted awkwardly, wondering if this was karma for all the dumb decisions he'd ever made in his life. 3 days later, Hyun-suk was face down in the dirt, letting out muffled groans that sounded like a kid who dropped their ice cream. Training with Reedrun was nothing short of pure hell. Every muscle in his body screamed, "We're done!" over and over again. The only thing keeping him from becoming one with the ground was Abelson Marriott, the ever-annoyed Saintess. She stood over him, her hands glowing as she healed him, but her expression made it clear she'd rather be anywhere else. To her, he was probably the most disgusting thing she'd ever seen. When she finished, Hyun-suk pushed himself up a little, scratching the back of his head like a kid who knew he was about to ask for something dumb. So I kinda need a favor." He hesitated for a second, then blurted it out all at once. "Can you, like, I don't know, pray for me or something so I don't die tomorrow? And, maybe come watch my fight, please?" Her icy expression cracked for just a moment. She blinked at him, like she wasn't sure if he was serious or just plain stupid. The day of the big fight finally rolled around, and the arena was packed to the brim with demons of all shapes and sizes. The crowd buzzed with excitement, the air electric with whispers and bets flying left and right. Why is a human even trying to pull this off? Is he brave or just out of his mind? Up in the VIP section, Hemis was practically bouncing in her seat, her grin so wide it was almost creepy. "So, Reedrun, who do you think is gonna win?" Reedrun barely glanced her way. "Hyun-suk will win," he said, his voice steady. "He's talented, and he's worked hard for this." Hemis's grin turned sly, her tone way too sweet to be genuine. How about we make this interesting? A bet. If Hyunsuk wins, you keep training him. Run raised an eyebrow. And if he loses? Hemi's smile twisted into something sharp and dangerous, like a cat playing with a mouse. Then you'll kill him yourself. After all, you're the one who vouched for him. Gotta take responsibility, right? Chill ran down Redrun's spine, but the weight of her gaze and his pride left him no choice. He nodded, even though his gut told him he was making a mistake. Down in the arena, Hyunsuk stood in the ring, trying his best to look calm even though his heart was pounding like crazy. He clenched his fists, taking a deep breath as he muttered to himself. All right, I'm in top shape. I leveled up, got a new skill. I've been training with Redrun. I can do this. He nodded, psyching himself up, even though the voice in his head was screaming, yeah, right. Hey, what are you spacing out for? Rachel's voice cut through the noise, sharp and annoyed. Hyunsuk's face turned red so fast it was like someone had flipped a switch. The truth? He'd been daydreaming about taking the silver-hailed saintess out on a date, but there was no way he was going to admit that out loud. The announcer's voice boomed across the arena, announcing entrance of Hyunsuk's opponent. The challenger's doom, the beast of destruction, the commander's trusted lieutenant, Kuriken. The crowd erupted as Kurken walked into the ring, his massive form casting a shadow that made Hyunsuk feel like a bug about to be squashed. The roar Kurken let out shook the arena, and Hyunsuk felt the ground tremble beneath his feet. He quickly activated his power measure glasses, scanning Kurken. What he saw made his stomach drop. Combat level 10,573. Are you kidding me? He muttered under his breath. Rachel's jaw dropped. No freaking way, that's not normal, something seriously messed up. Even Redrun, who barely ever showed emotion, looked concerned. Without knowing anything about Kurken's power number, he suspected there's something wrong here. Hemis leaned toward Redrun, her voice practically dripping with smugness. No backing out now, Redrun. A bet is a bet. Wiping the sweat from his face, Hyunsuk clenched his fists and muttered, why can't anything ever just be easy? But deep down, a tiny flicker of determination lit up inside him. The fight started with Hyunsuk charging straight at Kurken, looking like a guy trying to prove something. Or maybe just like someone who had no clue what he was doing. Kurken, the massive beast with a club the size of a car, spotted him from a mile away and swung hard. Hyunsuk barely ducked in time, feeling the wind from the club rush past his head. Kurken's swing missed, and Hyunsuk took his shot, slamming a punch right into the monster's ribs. He gritted his teeth and went for it again, this time putting everything he had into the punch. There was no way this one wouldn't leave a mark. Kurken, however, still standing there like he was completely unfazed, like Hyunsuk had just tickled him instead of trying to break his ribs. Oh no! Before Hyunsuk could even figure out his next move, Kurken's club came crashing toward him, swinging with the force of a freight train. The impact smashed into Hyunsuk's side, sending him flying across the arena like he was nothing more than a rag doll, his internal sarcasm the only thing keeping him from totally freaking out. Kurken, meanwhile, stood there looking bored. He wasn't even sweating, like this was just a warm-up for him. Hyunsuk glared at him, muttering under his breath, why is this guy still moving like he's not a walking donut after my punches? Then, like a light bulb flickering on in his head, he remembered something Redrun had said during training. It's not about strength, it's about the intent to kill. Without that, punches are just soft love taps. Back then, Hyunsuk had brushed it off, but now, standing face to face with Kurken's murderous glare, something about those words finally clicked in his brain. This wasn't just a fight, it was a life-or-death situation, and Kurken wasn't his sparring buddy, he was his executioner. Kurken charged at him again, swinging that massive club like he was trying to level the arena. But this time, Hyunsuk didn't back down. Instead of dodging or running, he sprinted straight at Kurken. His heart raced, adrenaline surging through his veins. If I'm going out swinging. Take this, he yelled, throwing a punch with everything he had. But this time, for the first time, there was something different in the way he moved. An intent to kill. The moment his fist connected, the impact was huge. Dust exploded everywhere, covering the arena in a thick cloud. The crowd fell silent, craning their necks to see what had happened. Hyunsuk had just pulled off Redrun's signature move. First form, instant obliteration. When the dust finally settled, Kurken was still standing, but with a gaping hole in his chest big enough to fit a boulder. The giant beast swayed for a moment before collapsing to the ground with a deafening thud. The arena went completely quiet, the shock so intense you could hear a pin drop. And then, all at once, the crowd erupted into cheers, their roars shaking the air. Hyunsuk, still trying to process what just happened. After hearing, "The winner is human Hyunsuk," he raised his trembling fist into the air. Hyunsuk barely registered the sound of the crowd losing their minds. His thoughts were somewhere else entirely. Redrun's combat style is insane, he thought to himself, still catching his breath. And also, I'm never doing this again. On the other hand, Rachel was happier than anyone, cheering for her hero and congratulating him after his great fight. However, Hyunsuk's happy moments didn't last long. His breath hitched as Kurken's body suddenly began to move. Hyunsuk froze, his voice catching in his throat. What? He stammered, his eyes glued to Kirkin's lifeless form. It was as if something else was controlling him, forcing his body to stagger upright. The crowd gasped and the announcer's voice cracked. Is this some kind of miracle? Hyunsuk's eyes widened in horror, his hands trembling at his sides. With that massive hole in Kirkin's chest and no heart left, it was impossible for him to be alive. Yet somehow Kirkin was moving. Hyunsuk's mind raced, his thoughts jumbling together. Hemis, she must have done something unnatural. Reborn figured it out too, his lips pressing into a thin line. Of course, he muttered. This has Hemis's filthy dark magic all over it. He clenched his fists, his mind piecing it together. She must have poured her dark mana into Kirkin, and then cursed him with the curse of the undying. Hemis, on the other hand, wasn't paying much attention to Kirkin anymore. Her sharp eyes were fixed on Hyunsuk, a faint smirk playing on her lips. How did this boy master such a complex combat art in such a short time? She tilted her head, her voice dropping to a whisper. Remarkable. Truly remarkable. Back in the arena, Hyunsuk stumbled back, his thoughts a chaotic mess. Is he alive? A zombie? Or what? He muttered, his voice trembling. Rachel, on the other hand, had a little information about this, stating, the Kirkin's body moving because of a curse, and its impact will disappear soon. But before Rachel could finish explaining, Kirkin charged at Hyunsuk again, his movements fast and relentless, just like before. The boy stood still, convinced that Kirkin was going to attack just like last time. If that was the case, it wouldn't be too hard to deal with him. But in less than the blink of an eye, before Hyunsuk could even react, Kirkin had grabbed him by the neck. This time, he was much faster than before. Without warning, Kirkin began pummeling Hyunsuk's face, landing one brutal punch after another. At first, Hyunsuk struggled to defend himself, barely managing to block a few hits. But after a few moments, he pulled himself together and locked his legs around Kirkin's arm. Using a technique you'd expect from a professional MMA fighter, Hyunsuk twisted with precision, aiming to break the monster's arm and render it useless. For a moment, Hyunsuk was confident his plan had worked. He was sure the technique had succeeded, but then he caught a glimpse of Kirkin's eyes, and they told a completely different story. That's when it hit him. He was about to pay the price for daring to hurt Kirkin's arm. In a flash, Kirkin hurled Hyunsuk like he was nothing more than a weightless ragdoll. The boy flew through the air at a speed faster than sound, crashing into the arena's wall in less than a second. The impact was devastating. For a moment, it felt like every bone in his body had shattered to pieces, just like the day that truck-kun had sent him to the afterlife. The pain was overwhelming. Suddenly, through the ringing in his ears and the noise of the stunned crowd, Hyunsuk heard a faint voice. It was weak but persistent, calling out to him, urging him not to give up. "Stand up and fight again," the voice cried. He turned his head slightly, his vision blurry, but he could just make out the person encouraging him. It was the Saintess, Abelson. She stood in the crowd, guarded by two cow-headed orcs, just like Reborn himself. Even though he had no idea how, Hyunsuk, battered and bruised, managed to move his head and search for the source of that voice. That's when he saw her, Abelson. She was whispering softly, "You can win, hero." Even if it was just his imagination, those words were all he needed. It was enough to spark a flicker of hope inside him, enough to give him a reason to push himself harder. He clenched his teeth and thought, I can't look pathetic in front of her, not in front of the only human girl in the demon army, and definitely not in front of the girl I plan to ask out on a date. Fueled by sheer determination, Hyunsuk summoned every ounce of energy he had left and tried to stand. His entire body trembled uncontrollably, and the sharp pain shooting through him made it clear some of his bones were probably broken. Still, he refused to stay down. It was in that moment, desperation mixed with determination, that Hyunsuk unknowingly tapped into his mana in a way he never had before. For the first time, he used mana to reinforce his damaged body, wrapping his broken arms in a protective layer of blue energy. With his newfound strength, Hyunsuk dashed forward, his entire body surging with energy. As he moved, his mana control leveled up, first from F to E, and then, as if the universe itself was rewarding his resolve, from E to D. In a flash, Hyunsuk leapt into the air, determination burning in his eyes. But instead of focusing on the fight, he did something completely unpredictable. From the bottom of his lungs, he shouted, "Abelson, go out on a date with me." The entire arena went silent for a moment, as if the world couldn't believe what it just heard. Meanwhile, Kirkin, who had been dominating the fight earlier, now seemed completely frozen in place. It was as if he was hypnotized, unable to move, caught off guard by the sudden surge of power radiating off Hyunsuk. Before Kirkin's cursed mind could even process what was happening, Hyunsuk slammed his head into the ground with all his strength. The impact was brutal. Kirkin's ugly face smashed into the ground, cracking and shattering the area around it. Yet somehow, Kirkin was still moving. Slowly but surely he began to get up, and now he looked even angrier than before. If Hyunsuk gave him even a second to recover, Kirkin would definitely tear him apart. But Hyunsuk wasn't scared anymore. In fact, he was starting to enjoy his newfound mana control. It made him forget all his pain, allowing him to attack faster and harder than ever before. With his fist glowing and pulsing with mana, he clenched it tight and unleashed a relentless barrage of punches on Kirken's head. He didn't give him even a fraction of a second to get up or fight back. The scene left the entire audience of demons in stunned silence. For the first time, they almost felt sorry for Kirken. Even Commander Hemis couldn't hide his surprise. He turned to Reedrun and asked, "Did you teach him how to control mana like that?" But Reedrun was just as shocked, if not more. He had never seen anyone use mana like this before, and it left him completely speechless. Watching Hyunsuk from a distance, heavily panting after violently taking down Kirken, while whispering to himself about planning the perfect day with Abelson to increase his chances of finally losing his virginity, Hemis turned to Reedrun and warned him, "You need to keep an eye on that boy. As a human in the demon army, he's starting to look more like a monster than anyone else, and it won't be long before he's completely uncontrollable." The day's battles came to an end, and hours later, Hyunsuk, beaten and wrapped in bandages, suddenly shot up from his bed, shouting and asking where he was. Rachel rushed to calm him down, explaining that he was in his cabin and that they had brought him there to rest after the match. Hyunsuk looked confused. It turned out he had passed out right after the fight and didn't even know if he had won or not. Rachel responded she hadn't chanced to tell him that he had won until now. On top of that, she mentioned that Abelson had come to heal him again, but left before he regained consciousness. The first thing Hyunsuk did was check his status. To his surprise, he had leveled up 12 times after defeating the cursed Kirken. It made everything he went through feel worth it. Along with that, he noticed that his mana control had leveled up twice, which brought a satisfied grin to his face. Hearing this took Rachel by surprise. Her reaction made Hyunsuk think she was overreacting again, but she quickly clarified that she wasn't shocked because she hadn't heard of mana control before. Instead, she was surprised because mastering mana control wasn't something that could level up so easily, let alone twice in a row. Just then, Hyunsuk's eyes caught something on his bed, making him momentarily tune out Rachel's explanation. His curiosity got the better of him, and he asked Rachel if she knew what it was. But before she could answer, the scene shifted to Abelson's room, where she was gazing out the window at the stars. Her eyes were fixed on the sky, but her thoughts were elsewhere, consumed by the strange feeling she had after today's battle. Abelson couldn't help but feel a bit impressed by Hyunsuk. In just 3 days, he had not only learned to control mana, but had also figured out how to fight with precision. It was unusual, almost unheard of. In Abelson's opinion, it would take any ordinary knight at least a month to achieve such a feat. The only explanation that came to her mind was that Hyunsuk wasn't just an ordinary human, he was someone with an unknown and untapped potential. The girl's mind was completely consumed with thoughts of Hyunsuk. The only thing holding her back from getting closer to him was his strange and unpredictable personality. Suddenly, she stood up and grabbed her cloak, while wondering if maybe it was divine intervention that had helped him win, though deep down she doubted it. As she put on her cloak, she whispered to herself that it might just be his talent that allowed him to win that battle. Abelson began walking toward the door, her thoughts racing. To her, Hyunsuk was the only hope she had left to achieve her goals. As soon as she reached the door, she knocked, which prompted the cow-headed orc standing outside to ask if she needed anything. The orc assumed she might want something to eat, drink, or perhaps help finding the bathroom. However, Abelson politely asked for a different favor. She requested permission to take a walk under the night sky. Meanwhile, back in Hyunsuk's cabin, the thing he had noticed earlier turned out to be a letter from Abelson. The letter invited him to meet her in the courtyard after sunset. Seeing the letter made Hyunsuk's mind race with ideas, and he couldn't help but think, was he actually being asked out on a date by the Saintess? A few minutes later, under the glow of the full moon, Hyunsuk arrived at the courtyard looking visibly nervous. For someone who had never dated a girl in his life, he had absolutely no idea what to do when the Saintess appeared, which only made his nerves worse. Meanwhile, Rachel wasn't happy about Hyunsuk being interested in another girl and was determined to convince him to get back to his cabin. Just then, Hyunsuk heard footsteps approaching. Panicking, he quickly grabbed Rachel and tried to hide her. But to his dismay, it wasn't just the Saintess Abelson alone. 2 huge, cow-headed orcs were escorting her. This was the last thing Hyunsuk wanted to deal with. Awkwardly, Hyunsuk blurted out asking why Abelson didn't come alone and why she was being followed by 2 massive, ugly demons. Abelson calmly explained that she wanted to come by herself, but the orcs wouldn't let her, as they were her guards because she was their prisoner. It was only then that Hyunsuk realized for the first time that Abelson was actually being held captive by the demon army. But instead of focusing on that, his thoughts kept circling back to the fact that, at 29 years old, he again lost his chance to become a grown man. That thought bothered him way more than it should have. Seeing how flustered Hyunsuk was, Abelson suggested they go for a walk, hoping it would help calm him down. He agreed, and the two of them started strolling with the two orc guards trailing close behind. Abelson seemed perfectly composed, but Hyunsuk was a complete mess. Walking alongside a girl was already overwhelming for him, and having those two intimidating orcs following them didn't help. He wanted to say something romantic, but his nerves, and the orcs, totally killed the mood. Unlike Hyunsuk, Abelson didn't seem bothered by the orcs at all, probably because she wasn't there for anything romantic. Out of the blue, she turned to him and asked, "You're a hero, right?" Hyunsuk's eyes widened in shock and said, "How do you know that?" Abelson just shrugged and replied, "It wasn't that hard to figure out. You've shown some pretty impressive growth, and besides that, only black-hailed guys in this world usually end up as heroes." Noticing how curious Hyunsuk seemed about her, Abelson smiled and said, "Go ahead, ask me anything you want to know about me." Hyunsuk's shocked expression quickly turned into pure joy, like he'd been waiting for this exact moment since the beginning, but then, almost as quickly, his excitement gave way to shyness. Blushing, he stammered out his first question. What do you think about me?" Abelson froze, clearly not expecting that to be his first question. Her expression twisted into something that looked like mild disgust as she prepared to respond and set things straight. But before she could say a word, Reedrun suddenly came barreling out of nowhere, running at full speed and yelling for Hyunsuk. Just when things were finally about to get interesting, his moment was ruined. Again. He couldn't help but feel disappointed as all his effort to get closer to Abelson was interrupted so easily. Reedrun, however, didn't care about Hyunsuk's feelings or why he was there with the Saintess. Instead, he urgently told him to drop everything and follow him to Commander Hemis's office. He wanted to say no, but he just couldn't muster the courage to do it. This whole situation left Abelson feeling a little disappointed too. She wasn't there to play along with Hyunsuk's romantic daydreams. She had more important matters to deal with. But now, with no other choice, she had to return to her prison. As soon as they arrived at Commander Hemis's office, Hemis greeted Hyunsuk with a smirk and congratulated him on his victory. "I have to admit, I'm impressed you didn't die after that brutal battle." Then, she got straight to the point. "Do you remember the proposal I made to you a while back?" Hyunsuk, trembling slightly, repeated her words from before, how he had to defeat the enemies she chose for him, one by one, in exchange for her protection. If he kept at it, he'd eventually earn a high rank and work directly under her. Hemis chuckled, leaning back in her chair. "You know," she said, "when I made that offer, I didn't actually expect you to survive this long. It was just meant to make things a bit more entertaining for me. Now, though, after seeing your potential, I've changed my mind." She raised a hand and pointed directly at Reedrun. "Do you remember what you told me about him?" she asked. "You said this boy could undoubtedly become a commander someday." Hemis turned her gaze back to Hyunsuk. "I believe in you now. But I have something different in mind for you. Letting you waste away as a squad leader isn't going to cut it." It was clear she had bigger plans for him. Plans that Hyunsuk wasn't sure if he was ready for. This time, Hemis brought up the disaster that had happened to the demon chefs not too long ago, explaining how the army's food supplies had drastically decreased. She added with a grim tone that if things didn't get sorted out soon, they might end up eating each other. Hyunsuk, as clueless as ever, had no idea why she was telling him all this. That's when the demon commander stepped closer, placed a hand on his shoulder and dropped the bombshell. "From now on, you're in charge of the cooking unit. You're replacing Chef Kukan's position." She went on to explain that he had the authority to choose whoever he wanted to work under him, but everything had to be organized and ready within 2 days. Hyunsuk's day couldn't have gone worse. First, he lost his chance to get closer to the Saintess, and now he was stuck with the extra responsibility of feeding an entire army of demons. All he could do was force a smile and say, "I'll do my best." A few moments later, he was dismissed. When he stepped outside, Rachel was waiting for him, and as usual, she started complaining. "Why would you agree so easily to work as the head chef for the demon army? You're supposed to be a hero to kill them." Hyunsuk was already at his limit, completely exhausted and frustrated. Rachel's nagging only made things worse, pushing him to the edge. He caught himself thinking about giving her a good smack on the backside just to shut her up. Somehow Hyunsuk managed to keep his cool, gripping a piece of paper in his hand and looking a little lost about what to do next. Then, out of nowhere, an idea hit him. He quickly put on his special glasses and started searching for new members for the hunting and kitchen team. It didn't take long before he spotted someone with glowing eyes, crouched down and busy doing something on the ground. Curious, Hyunsuk called out to him. When the figure turned around, it turned out to be a golem, or goblin. Looked like a golem, honestly. He really looked like a knockoff version of Smeagol from The Lord of the Rings, only somehow even uglier. Smeagol, clearly unaware of Hyunsuk's new position as head chef, rudely sneered at him. "What's wrong with you, slave? Have you lost your mind, thinking you can talk to a demon like that?" Hyunsuk froze. Smeagol's words hit him hard, or at least he acted like they did. Deep down, though, he wasn't about to let this slide. For someone who'd spent his whole new life bowing down to every senior goblin and showing them endless respect, this was his chance to turn things around and make up for all those humiliating moments. Without saying another word, Hyunsuk marched straight up to the golem and, with all his strength, kicked him square in the face. "From now on, you'll call me the unit commander. Got it?" After strutting around for a bit, Hyunsuk told Smeagol to gather all the remaining chefs and soldiers from the cooking unit. The golem reluctantly did as he was told and rounded everyone up. The first thing Hyunsuk did was check their power levels using his trusty power measuring glasses. The average power level was around 2,000, with the strongest barely reaching 3,500. As he kept his glasses on, he couldn't help but think, weren't there more than 300 soldiers here last time? Disappointment hit him hard as he realized there were now less than 30 of them left. He sighed, wondering how he was supposed to hunt and cook with such a small team, but then he quickly shook the thought away. The last thing he wanted was to end up as Hemis's dinner for failing his duties. No time to overthink, he told himself. Hyunsuk asked if any of the goblins knew the name of a strong goblin commander who might be able to help them. However, most of them didn't seem to know about his new position and didn't take him seriously at all. Some even started mocking him, calling him Machine Barbecue, and questioning why he thought he could boss them around. Among the unruly crowd was one particularly annoying, brain-damaged goblin who started yelling at the top of his lungs that, in his opinion, Hyunsuk wasn't anything but a delicious human snack and nothing more. Hyunsuk didn't even let him finish. Like a missile, he launched himself at the loudmouth goblin, slamming into him with full force. The poor goblin flew backward, crashing hard into the wall, and stopped moving on the spot, completely confused about what had just happened. Hyunsuk straightened himself up and decided it was time to set things straight. "I'm the new commander of the cooking unit." To back up his words, he pulled out the official order signed by Commander Hemis, appointing him as the new head chef and unit commander. He held it up for everyone to see, making sure there was no room for doubt. After making his point, he asked the goblins why there were so few of them left. One goblin, showing respect with a military salute, stepped forward and explained that after the disaster of facing Thalasis, the remaining soldiers had been forced to go hunting without a leader, and most of them were killed by wild monsters. That's when everything started to make sense to Hyunsuk, especially after remembering how goblins always charged into battle without thinking. For his last question, Hyunsuk asked who the best cook among them was. They all shouted "Gyalum" at once. The same ugly goblin who looked just like Smeagol. Without thinking too much about it, Hyunsuk made the ugly goblin his sub-commander and asked if anyone had any objections. After seeing what happened to the goblin who had hurt Hyunsuk's pride earlier, nobody dared to say a word. After settling things with the goblins, Hyunsuk returned to his seat, deep in thought. He realized he would need at least 200 soldiers to manage all the kitchen work. That meant recruiting more than 170 new members in a single day. At first it seemed impossible, but then a strange idea crossed his mind. Early the next morning, Hyunsuk, Bobo, and Rachel set out to look for new recruits. As they walked, Rachel asked if Bobo was the method he planned to use to gather new members. Hyunsuk smirked and replied that Bobo was his backup plan, Plan B, just in case his first plan didn't work. Hyunsuk's head kept spinning as he looked around, searching for anyone who met his conditions. First, they had to be easy to replace, and second, they couldn't dare to rebel against him. It didn't take long before he spotted his first victim. Without wasting time, he jumped over and happily kicked a big goblin right in the face. The poor goblin dropped to the ground, completely clueless about why he was getting beaten up for no reason. Hyunsuk named him Mole on the spot and told him to join the kitchen unit. When Mole hesitated, Hyunsuk didn't give him another second to think. He landed another kick, this time to the goblin's jaw, speeding up the decision-making process. Hyunsuk repeated himself, explaining that it was his first time recruiting anyone. He added that, according to the demon hierarchy, which was based on timing and abuse, if Mole accepted, he would work directly under Hyunsuk and be above every new recruit he was planning to find later that day. The goblin, who really did look like a mole, was shocked and confused as Hyunsuk went on to explain that, besides joining his unit, he also needed to find others to take the blame for him. Mole hadn't even agreed to join yet, but Hyunsuk was already acting like it was a done deal. Hyunsuk ordered him to go out and bring back 5 of his friends to join the kitchen unit, making it sound like it was all for Mole's benefit. Hyunsuk's tone suddenly became kind as he promised that if Mole succeeded in bringing his friends, as long as they got punished and took 5 hits for anything, Mole would only get 1 hit. This was Hyunsuk's first plan in action, multi-level scheme. Meanwhile, on the other side of the castle, someone was calmly enjoying his meal using a fork and knife. It was another high-ranking demon commander of an unknown race. His name was Doras, and it wasn't clear if he was an orc, goblin, ogre, or some kind of beast. But unlike the mystery surrounding his race, his personality was strikingly obvious. He was elegant and obsessed with details. Suddenly, a goblin burst into his room without permission, completely ruining his peaceful moment. The goblin was frantic as he shouted, "Sir, all of our battalion members are gone." Doris frowned. He wasn't pleased to hear that his subordinates had abandoned their posts. It didn't make sense to him. After all, their only job was to serve him, nothing else. Still panicking, the goblin quickly clarified, "No, sir, it's not like that. Our battalions, they've been drafted as cooks for the army." Doris paused for a moment. He remembered hearing that a human had recently taken over as the head chef of the demon army. He also knew that Commanders Hemis and Reedrun held this human in high regard. Wanting to avoid unnecessary conflict, he calmly instructed the goblin to let it slide and only warned the human chef not to repeat such actions in the future. But the goblin wasn't done. "No, sir, you don't understand. It's not that simple. He's already taken over 200 of our soldiers to use as cooks." Daras's eyes narrowed. That was far too many, even for someone of high standing. At that moment, he realized he would have to step in and handle the situation himself. Back at Hyunsok's location, most of his new recruits had gathered around him. He was sitting confidently in front of them, acting overly smug, as if he were the smartest person alive for managing to recruit over 200 cooks in such a short time. Suddenly, a distant voice shouting, "That's enough!" caught Hyunsok's attention. The voice belonged to Daras, or maybe it was the goblin perched on his shoulder, pointing the way toward him. Hyunsok instantly realized this wasn't going to end well. Daras didn't look happy, not one bit. Panicking slightly, Hyunsok quickly grabbed his glasses to measure Daras's power. But to his dismay, the glasses couldn't calculate it. The only thing this told him was that Daras's power exceeded 50,000. That's when it hit him. He needed to wrap things up and get out of there before the demon arrived. But before he could make his escape, Doras shouted, "Is Hyunsok the one who serves Bobo here?" Hyunsok, who had been slowly inching away in an attempt to slip out unnoticed, froze. Unfortunately, Bobo wasn't on the same page and betrayed his plan by drawing attention to him. Thinking quickly, before things completely spiraled out of control, Hyunsok stepped forward, jumping in front of Doras with a nervous smile. He acted as if he'd never intended to leave in the first place and said, "What an honor to see you, sir. What brings you here today?" In response, Doras formally introduced himself, his name, his rank, and his title. With a not-so-happy expression but still maintaining a polite tone, he answered Hyunsok's question about why he was there. He gestured toward the goblins standing behind him and explained that he was there because Hyunsok had taken most of his battalion's soldiers without even asking for permission. It was at that moment Hyunsok realized what had happened. Those sneaky goblins must have brought all their friends from their own unit, which just so happened to be the same battalion. But there was nothing Hyunsok could do about it now, so he plastered on a fake smile to hide his discomfort. Doras, however, didn't react like other demons might have. Instead of throwing a fit or resorting to violence, he calmly suggested they head to his office to resolve the issue peacefully. Hyunsok quickly agreed. What else could he do? That was also the moment when he realized why he didn't doubt everything had been going so strangely well. Almost too smoothly. Once they entered Doras's office, Hyunsok began explaining himself. He claimed that he had simply chosen the bravest soldiers he could find and insisted it was all random. It was a lie but was best excuse for now. Doras, on the other hand, couldn't help but recall how much Reedrun and Hemis favored this human. For his own sake, he decided it was best not to make a big deal out of the situation. The tension in the room eased as Doras's serious demeanor shifted into a cheerful one. With a surprising smile, he told Hyunsok he could use the soldiers he had chosen however he liked. Hearing this made the boy Hyunsok feel relieved, thinking it wasn't as complicated as he had imagined. However, his relief didn't last long. Doras suddenly added that he had one condition if Hyunsok wanted to keep his soldiers working as cooks. The ugly demon explained his only condition is that he wants Hyunsok to take another one of his soldiers with him. Hyunsok couldn't help but feel suspicious. Was Doras trying to offload one of his worst soldiers onto him? Maybe someone who would just cause extra work or trouble? These thoughts swirled in his mind, and his hesitation was evident. Doras didn't seem to appreciate the hesitation, especially after he had so generously allowed 200 of his soldiers to work for Hyunsok. The boy quickly realized this and started mumbling and stuttering, trying to smooth things over. "Oh no, I didn't mean to offend you. Actually, it makes me happy to have another soldier." Hearing Hyunsok's approval, Doras didn't waste any time. He turned to introduce the soldier he was talking about. The office door creaked open, and a massive hand emerged, first gripping the doorframe with incredible strength. As Doras spoke, he revealed the soldier's name, Usaru. The next moment, Usaru stepped into view, his colossal body towering over everyone. He was a hybrid, born from an orc and an ogre, and his sheer size and presence were overwhelming. As expected, Usaru's power was immeasurable, just like Doras's, which meant he was extremely strong. Hyunsok stood frozen, completely stunned as he stared up at Usaru. He couldn't believe his eyes. He never expected Doras to hand over such a powerful soldier. He kinda liked this offer, but the only problem was Usaru's glaring flaw. He was clearly seemed to be one of the dumbest demons around. It wasn't entirely clear whether Doras had given Yunsuk Yusaru as a genuine favor or just to cause him trouble. But Doras acted like it was a grand gesture of goodwill. With nothing left to discuss, Hyunsuk left Doras's office and gathered all the new recruits. To establish his authority, he introduced himself as Bobo's caretaker and the new commander of the Cook army. Strangely enough, the soldiers seemed far more impressed and terrified by Bobo than by Hyunsuk himself. Even from a distance, they were visibly horrified just watching the monstrous creature, and that reaction was exactly what Hyunsuk had hoped for. Without needing to say a single word, he made it clear that disobeying him would likely result in becoming Bobo's next meal. Unlike Kulkin, Hyunsuk had a plan to organize the soldiers and get the best results from them. He had even prepared a detailed roster specifically for the task. Handing it over to the group, he instructed everyone to read the roster and line up accordingly. Even Rachel, who was usually quick to understand Hyunsuk's plans, had no idea what criteria he had used to divide the recruits. When she asked, Hyunsuk shrugged and explained that since most of them had similar intelligence levels, he had simply sorted them by their combat power. It turned out he had assigned the weakest soldiers and those with prior cooking experience to kitchen duty, while the rest were put on hunting teams. The boy was once again acting overly confident about how smart he was and seemed eager to see if his plan would work. Soon everyone moved to their positions. One side was the combat unit and the other was the culinary unit. To make sure everything was running smoothly, Hyunsuk asked if anyone had an issue with their assigned roles. One of them raised his hand and shouted, "I've got a problem, boss." To everyone's surprise, it was an ugly, weak-looking guy who had been assigned to kitchen duty. He wanted to join the hunting team instead so he could eat fresh meat on the spot. Pretending to care about the goblin's request, Hyunsuk gestured for him to come closer. The ugly goblin hesitated for a moment, sensing that something fell off, but eventually he decided to step forward. As soon as he got close enough, Hyunsuk landed a heavy kick directly in his balls, saying, "This is the entrance exam for the hunting unit. If you can handle the pain, you're in." Unfortunately, the pain was unbearable for any man, and this goblin was no exception. He failed on the spot. Suddenly, system windows appeared around Hyunsuk, informing him that his hidden talents, charisma, and leadership had just leveled up because of his recent actions. To finish the task, Hyunsuk shouted, asking if anyone else had a problem that needed his help, but no one dared to speak up. Clearing his throat, he started yelling again, this time even louder than before, ordering the combat unit to grab their weapons and get ready for the hunt. Not long after they arrived at the hunting location, everyone gathered, waiting for Hyunsuk's command. On the way there, they hadn't come across a single monster, which was disappointing for the boy. Rachel mentioned that maybe it was because of Bobo and Usaru. She thought their incredibly strong presence might have scared the monsters away. Looking at them, Hyunsuk couldn't help but think the same. It made sense, but since Bobo and Usaru were the strongest among them, he couldn't just leave them behind at the castle. Rachel then came up with an idea. She suggested they could lure the monsters using bait. At first, Hyunsuk thought she meant using some meat to draw the monsters out of their hiding spots. However, Rachel's plan wasn't as simple as that, or at least not in her opinion. She wanted to use biobait, like all the goblins, to lure the demonic beasts to their location. Even Hyunsuk, who was usually pretty ruthless when it came to dealing with demons, was shocked to hear what Rachel, an angel of all people, was planning for those poor goblins. Eventually, Hyunsuk gave in and agreed to do what Rachel suggested, since he really didn't want to return empty-handed. He called out a few goblins to step forward based on their assigned roster numbers: 14, 3, 1, 43, and 7. Feeling a bit awkward when Rachel asked how he picked those specific numbers, Hyunsuk explained that they were the serial numbers from a lottery ticket he had left behind on Earth. The memory brought up some sadness for him, but to shake it off, Hyunsuk quickly turned to Yusaru and commanded him to grab number 14. The giant hybrid demon had been waiting for this moment. In an instant, he pounced on the goblin Hyunsuk pointed at, who had no clue why he was being singled out. With a smirk, Hyunsuk muttered, "Intercontinental ballistic goblin," and ordered Yusaru to throw the poor creature as far as he could. Yusaru didn't hesitate. He used all his strength and hurled the goblin so fast and so far that it vanished in the blink of an eye. It had been Rachel's idea, but Hyunsuk seemed to enjoy it more than anyone. He even started thinking that if they kept launching weak soldiers like that, they might eventually lure the monsters out of hiding. Suddenly, he pointed at another demon, scaring the poor guy senseless, and told him to light a fire so the thrown soldiers could see the smoke and find their way back. Rachel couldn't help but remind Hyunsuk that if he kept letting Usaru throw them like that, none of the goblins would survive. But Hyunsuk just shrugged it off. He didn't care. Even if 1 out of 6 makes it back alive, that's good enough for me, he said with a grin. Watching Usaru hurl the goblins one by one, the demon soldiers began trembling in fear, terrified of dying at such a young age. Most of them wanted to live long lives, and the situation made them realize they could be the next victim. One of the goblins decided to make a run for it, hoping to avoid the same fate as number 14. Unfortunately for him, Bobo had already picked up the scent of betrayal. Within seconds, Bobo tracked him down, and no matter how much the goblin begged or pleaded, Bobo simply did what it does best, enjoying its first meal of the day. Hunsa could hear the goblin's cries for help, but his mind was focused on a different problem: why none of the goblins Usaru threw had returned yet. Just as he was lost in thought, the ground began to shake, and a deep rumbling noise filled the air. Moments later, number 14 came into view, running for his life with dozens of worm and butterfly-like monsters chasing after him. The sight brought a wave of excitement to Hyunsuk. Their plan was finally working. Now, all they had to do was use the soldiers to surround and hunt the monsters. But his excitement quickly turned to shock when he noticed Usaru suddenly lose control. Without waiting for any command, the hybrid demon charged straight toward the swarm of monsters. As a brainless yet battle-loving demon, Usaru couldn't resist the thrill of a fight. Ignoring Hyunsuk's carefully laid plan, Usaru single-handedly massacred every single monster that number 14 had barely managed to lure back. Hyunsuk could only stand there, helplessly watching the one-sided massacre and how their carefully thought-out plan was falling apart. It seemed even Bobo couldn't resist and decided to join Usaru, happily smashing monsters with a single blow. Meanwhile, Hyunsuk dropped to the ground, crying like a little kid after realizing he hadn't gained anything at all after such a long and exhausting day. With no other options left, he decided to try again tomorrow, but this time without Usaru and Bobo. That's when Rachel reminded him, "You do realize that means you'll only have 1 day left before Hemis turns you into stew, right?" Her words hit hard, but Hyunsuk's brain had already stopped functioning properly. He waved everyone off and dismissed them, telling them to regroup the next morning. Minutes later, as soon as they returned to Fortress, Hyunsuk didn't head to his cabin. Instead, he made his way straight to the kitchen, as he wanted to double-check if the smashed and ruined monster meat could still be used for anything. Trying to act like he was still in control, he cleared his throat dramatically and entered the kitchen with a loud, heavy kick to the door, shouting, "Where are those rascals? Gather here right now!" Galam, the one in charge of the kitchen after Hyunsuk, quickly showed up, clearly startled by the commotion. Without wasting any time, Hyunsuk cut straight to the point and demanded, "Did you get the meat from today's hunt or not?" Poor Galam started stuttering as he explained that he did manage to get the meat, but it didn't look good at all. Hyunsuk knew it wasn't really Galam's fault. He knew exactly who was to blame. But since he couldn't directly call out Bobo and Usaru, he decided to vent his frustration by blaming Galam instead, just to make himself feel a little better. Then, feeling hopeless, Hyunsuk asked if Galam, with all his experience as one of the demon army's chefs, knew how to prepare something like minced meat. Galam's reply was long but clear: he didn't have that kind of knowledge. According to him, maybe a personal chef of a battalion commander might know something about it. Hearing Galam's disappointing response, Hyunsuk dismissed him. Galam scurried off to gather the other cooks as Hyunsuk had previously commanded. Left alone, Hyunsuk sank into his thoughts again, brooding over how everyone, ranked below a battalion commander, had to endure living off bland, repetitive food day after day. The same idea that had crossed his mind during his first hunt with Chef Kukan resurfaced. The thought of changing everything by cooking delicious food and using it to gather loyal followers. Hyunsuk decided to take action. He went straight to Abelson's quarters, knocked on the door, and asked for permission to enter. Abelson granted it, and he stepped inside, determined to push his plan forward. Blushing and smiling, Hyunsuk stepped into the room slowly, apologizing for disturbing her rest. As usual, Rachel was furious, jealous all over again at how Hyunsuk had found another excuse to come and see this girl, but, just like before, he completely ignored her. Out of nowhere, Hyunsuk pulled out a perfectly cooked, good-looking steak and offered it to Abelson as her dinner. He said it was a small token of appreciation for healing him multiple times and helping him win the final match. Abelson looked surprised, and, considering she was actually hungry, she decided to accept it. Soon she attempted to eat but paused for a moment, her face showing a hint of suspicion. It was almost like she was afraid the food might be laced with something, maybe even something soporific that could lead her into trouble with this horny guy in the demon army. To be sure, she gave it a good sniff, checking for anything unusual, but instead of something off-putting, the aroma was surprisingly good. Not hesitating much longer, she took her first bite. As soon as she did, her eyes widened in shock. Far wider than Hyunsuk had ever seen. The flavor was incredible, something far better than anything she'd eaten, not only here, but even back in the human castle. In less than a minute, she devoured the entire steak, leaving Hyunsuk feeling both relieved and happy to see that his lover had enjoyed the food he made. With nothing else to say, Hyun-suk awkwardly turned to leave the room. However, before he could step out, Abelson stopped him. The flat-chested girl suddenly blurted out a question, wondering what Hyun-suk, as a hero, planned to do in the future once he was free from the demon's prison. Without a moment's thought, Hyun-suk confidently answered, marriage. It wasn't the response Abelson was expecting. At first, she was stunned, staring at him in disbelief, and then quickly turned her head away, telling him to leave if he had nothing better to say. She already knew this guy was a pervert and completely shameless. But when Hyun-suk added that there was something else he wanted to do besides getting married, her curiosity got the best of her. She hesitated for a moment before turning back to him, wondering what else he could possibly mean. Hyun-suk, however, didn't elaborate. Instead, he flipped the question back on her, asking what she wanted to do once she escaped the demon's castle. Abelson hesitated again, her eyes fixed on the ground. After a few seconds of silence, she finally muttered she didn't want to do anything. Nothing at all. The scene shifted to the capital of the Gartran Divine Empire, Gratium, a theocracy ruled by the Pope of the Duist Church. There, a man knelt before the king, reporting that they had located the next saintess, Abelson. According to the man's latest report, the saintess was being held captive at the Black Fortress of the demon army. The king, seated on his throne, had been expecting the demon army to send a messenger by now, demanding something in exchange for their hostage, but that hadn't happened yet. The king reviewed what he knew about the Black Fortress. During the long war between humans and demons, the fortress had only been breached a handful of times, and those were times when Hemis wasn't there. In his judgment, launching a reckless assault to rescue the saintess would be nothing short of suicide. Instead of sending a full army, which would likely result in massive casualties and failure, he decided on a different approach, sending a small, skilled group to carry out the rescue mission. The first person to come to his mind was the hero of their empire, Sir Oseld, and so the Emperor of Gartran, who was also the Pope of the Church, Orvan IV, ordered one of his subordinates to summon him immediately. The next day, around the fortress, Hyun-suk gathered his entire battle unit and split them into two teams. Naturally, Usura and Bobo weren't included as he didn't want them messing up his plans. His mind was completely preoccupied with Abelson and her words about not wanting to do anything, all while carrying a huge backpack. After some searching, he finally found the spot he was looking for. He dropped his backpack and called for the platoon leaders to step forward. Without wasting time, Hyun-suk pulled something out and, in a firm tone, ordered them to eat it. What he revealed was some kind of meat, hanging on by a thread. The platoon leaders exchanged confused glances, unsure of what was happening. They were wondering why was their boss suddenly handing out food before the hunt had even started. The only things that crossed their minds were that it might be leftovers or, stranger still, some kind of bribe. But when Hyun-suk gave them a warning look, they didn't dare to refuse. In a rush, they all grabbed a piece and started eating, unsure of what else to do. The moment the meat touched their tongues, though, everything changed. The taste was so incredible, so mind-blowingly good, that they were practically in ecstasy. 3 of them dropped to their knees immediately, pledging their unwavering loyalty to Hyun-suk in exchange for just one more bite of that heavenly food. Hyun-suk, however, refused their pleas, smiling like he had some evil plan brewing in his mind. He ordered everyone to go out and capture as many monsters and beasts alive as they could. To make things more interesting, he added that the platoon who caught the most monsters would get the privilege of eating that amazing meat with him for dinner. Before Hyun-suk could even finish his words, everyone scattered, rushing toward different parts of the forest to catch monsters alive. His plan was working perfectly, and he could hardly wait to see the results. Half a day went by, and Hyun-suk spent that time slashing through the captured monsters to gain experience one after another. Even just landing the final blows was exhausting because there were so many of them. It was the simplest strategy and made Hyun-suk leveled up 10 times, and he couldn't be happier about it. Once everyone finished their task and gathered all the monsters and animals they had captured, one of the platoon leaders finally worked up the courage to ask who the winner was. In response, Hyun-suk declared that the Wolfgang platoon was the winner of the day. He promised them a luxurious and delicious meal with him as their reward. When a goblin hesitantly asked, "What about the rest of us? Don't we deserve something too?" Hyun-suk coldly replied, "I don't care about losers, all I can give you is some leftovers." And so, no one dared to complain. After getting everything sorted, Hyun-suk urged everyone to pack up the slaughtered meat and move it to the kitchen. Hours later, as darkness settled over the fortress, an unknown assassin snuck into the castle, silently massacring anyone who crossed his path, without a shred of mercy. Standing behind a door, the intruder finally found what they had come for. It seemed their target was Abelson, who remained completely unaware of the danger, lost in thought about her earlier conversation with Hyun-suk. The door creaked open, and the mysterious figure entered Abelson's room, calling her name before doing anything else. Suddenly, he removed his cloak, revealing his face, and calmly announced that he was there to rescue her. As expected, Abelson was completely shocked. She recognized him immediately, calling him Sir Geffen and asking if the Pope had sent him to save her. Geffen didn't give a clear answer, dodging the question entirely. That's when Abelson, with a trembling voice, declared that she didn't want to return to the church. She politely asked Geffen to stop insisting and to leave before anyone noticed he was there. But Geffen wasn't having it. He wasn't willing to leave without her, as he had gone through too much trouble to get this far. Realizing he wasn't going to back down, Abelson gave him a warning. She told him firmly that if he didn't leave her alone immediately, she would use her holy power to summon Hemis. To her surprise, Geffen didn't look scared at all. In fact, he seemed amused, smirking as though he didn't take her threat seriously. Instead, he casually remarked that he was actually curious to see if the rumors about her were true, particularly the ones about her boobs being as big as everyone said. Suddenly, he grabbed the girl by the neck, justifying it by saying he's a soldier and has to follow orders from his superiors. He was determined to take her back even if she didn't want to go. The boy planned to press on her neck until she passed out, making sure she wouldn't cause any trouble for him. Abelson tried to resist using her holy powers, but it was useless against Geffen. That was the moment she slowly started losing hope and eventually fainting. Out of nowhere, without any warning, someone appeared and punched the guy in the head. To everyone's surprise, it was Hyunsuk, stepping in bravely to show exactly what happens when someone dares to hurt his lover like that. Even though Hyunsuk used all his magical and physical strength in the punch, Geffen's head didn't even budge. The only result was a small cut on his lip, causing it to bleed a little. Geffen was stunned and confused, wondering why a human was in the demon's castle and why he was attacking him. Hyunsuk, furious and protective, demanded Geffen let go of Abelson immediately, warning him he'd make him regret it if he didn't. However, Geffen didn't back down. With a swift kick, he caught Hyunsuk off guard. To make matters worse, Geffen announced he planned to take Hyunsuk back to the human empire as well. For the first time in a long time, Hyunsuk, a skilled and experienced fighter, failed to anticipate the move. It left him defenseless, unable to protect himself. He collapsed to the ground unconscious, just like Abelson. Geffen looked at him with disdain, dismissing him as nothing more than a pesky little nuisance. Meanwhile, Rachel was secretly watching the whole scene unfold. She was horrified to see the hero taken down with a single strike. Desperate to find someone who could help, she realized there was no one she could rely on except Bobo. Before she could act, however, she suddenly felt an overwhelming, powerful presence approaching from behind. Back in the room, Geffen was staring at a large scroll, trying to figure out what to do about this situation involving an unwanted person. The scroll was ridiculously long, and it kept slipping out of his hands as he fumbled with it. Just then, someone casually walked into the room and said, "Oh, having some trouble? Need a hand?" It was Hemis, finally showing up before things could spiral further out of control because of a single human. Geffen froze in horror, quickly turning to face the newcomer. Hemis was quite infamous among humans, often referred to as Glutton Hemis. When Geffen accidentally called her by that name, she casually corrected him in her usual laid-back tone, saying she much preferred to be called Gourmet. The overconfident Geffen, who had just knocked Hyunsuk out cold with one blow, was now trembling, practically shaking in his boots. The sheer amount of magical energy radiating from the demon in front of him was enough to make him feel like he'd bitten off more than he could chew. Recalling the famous story about her devouring thousands of soldiers in just one day suddenly felt much more believable to Geffen. Now on high alert, he slowly started tidying up the scroll, trying to keep his composure. That was when Hemis decided it was time to test just how skilled and strong her unwanted guest really was. Her overwhelming aura filled the room, pressing down on Geffen like a crushing weight. With the scroll clenched tightly in his mouth, Geffen reminded himself to stay calm and not panic. His plan was simple: create an opening, grab the Saintess, and escape without getting caught. But there was one thing he hadn't accounted for. A wave of dizziness began to wash over him, making his head spin. Geffen couldn't help but wonder, was it that guy's punch earlier that caused this? Or was it because of Hemis? The combination of dizziness and overthinking left him distracted, and that was all Hemis needed. In the blink of an eye, she severed his right hand. Now, using just a small fraction of her true power, Hemis was thrilled at the idea of having a long, exciting fight with this boy. But Geffen, who had already lost a hand before he could even make a move, had other plans. He was now focused on one thing: getting out alive before it was too late. Without hesitating, he cast an emergency teleportation spell and fled, leaving the Saintess behind. The worst part for him wasn't just failing his mission, was also losing a hand and leaving it behind in the demon's castle. Hemis, on the other hand, was left disappointed. She had been looking forward to a proper fight with this handsome young man who, in her opinion, also looked quite delicious, but much to her dismay, The fight never happened. From a very long time ago, Hemis was actually one of the most famous demons, not just in the demon army, but among all the other races as well. She had earned many titles over time, like Glutton, Ancient Monster, and Ageless Witch. Her fame wasn't anything complicated or mysterious. Through the endless passage of time, countless demons were born and destroyed, but among them, only the Demon King and Hemis remained unshaken, standing firm like mountains. A few days later, Hyunsuk's day began with a hard punch to his stomach, sending him crashing to the ground, courtesy of Reedrun. Once again, Reedrun pointed out his weaknesses, which included attacking and using magic in such a straightforward, predictable way. In Reedrun's opinion, Hyunsuk needed to be more flexible and stop boxing himself into such a rigid fighting style. Hyunsuk was fully aware of this flaw, but as an MMA fighter, he had spent years perfecting this approach to combat, and couldn't just change it overnight. Reedrun also aimed to train Hyunsuk mentally, reminding him that no matter how strong he became, there would always be someone stronger. The key, according to Reedrun, was to never hesitate and to use any means necessary to secure victory when facing an opponent. Reedrun extended his hand and helped Hyunsuk sit up, offering one final piece of advice. A fair victory is a privilege reserved only for the truly strong. With that, Hyunsuk's coach gave him a small smile, called it a day, and left before him. Hyunsuk put on a fake smile, pretending everything was fine, and waved goodbye to the cow-headed orc. But as soon as Reedrun was out of sight, he collapsed back onto the ground, feeling completely drained, both mentally and physically. Rachel appeared almost immediately, concern written all over her face, and asked if there was anything she could do to help. Hyunsuk, without hesitation, asked her if she could heal him. Even though Hyunsuk's attitude toward her wasn't exactly the kindest, Rachel decided to heal him anyway. As she focused on mending his injuries, Hyunsuk's mind started drifting uncontrollably. He couldn't help but think back to his last encounter with Abelson. He remembered her telling him to get as strong as possible. Hyunsuk didn't know why all of a sudden Abelson asked him to get stronger, and that thought was bothering him. As a saintess, Abelson believed that only strength born from within, which she meant faith in his own power, would truly protect him. Like an idiot, Hyunsuk ended up sharing these thoughts with Rachel. As expected, Rachel's jealousy and of course anger flared up again. She hated seeing her hero looking so down because of that saintess. In Rachel's eyes, Abelson was far from saintly. She looked more like a witch. With a mocking tone, Hyunsuk reminded her that calling a saintess a witch might just earn her some divine punishment. But Rachel, still visibly irritated and, of course, jealous, snapped back. As someone who had witnessed the events of that day firsthand, she declared there was no way Abelson could be a true saintess. Rachel argued that if Abelson were really a saintess, why would an assassin use holy power to try and kill her? Hyunsuk had to admit her point made sense. And there was something else. If the saintess was supposed to be such a valuable figure for humanity and the divine empires, why would they send someone with a holy power to take her out? Without giving a proper answer, Hyunsuk just shrugged and suggested it was better not to overthink it. Rachel, on the other hand, only got angrier, convinced he was saying this because he cared too much about Abelson. She started yelling at him again, calling him a woman-crazed moth for paying so much attention to Abelson lately instead of her. Hyunsuk couldn't deal with her temper anymore. He quickly covered his ears and backed away before Rachel could actually kill him. A little while later, something else happened, and Hyunsuk was feeling down again. This time, even worse than before. Neither Rachel nor Bobo had any idea what was bothering him. Without paying much attention to his surroundings, Hyunsuk muttered quietly under his breath, complaining about how his life was over. He even started pleading to the gods, asking them to let him be reborn as a rich family's pet cat in his next life. Bobo and Rachel exchanged worried glances, growing more and more curious about what had happened to make him say such ridiculous things. Finally, unable to hold back their curiosity, they pushed Hyunsuk to explain everything. As it turned out, about 30 minutes earlier, he had been summoned to Hemis's office. There, she shared her so-called dilemma. Of course, it wasn't anything Hyunsuk might have hoped for, like her feeling lonely or something sentimental. No, her issue was far simpler. She was bored out of her mind. Everything in her life had been running smoothly and perfectly normal lately, which, for a demon like Hemis, was the worst kind of monotony. To make things fun again, she casually announced that Hyunsuk would have to fight the battalion commander in a month. Sweat dripped down Hyunsuk's face. Unlike last time, he already knew exactly who Hemis wanted him to fight. But just to confirm he wasn't misunderstanding, he asked in a trembling voice, "The battalion commander?" Hemis nodded, confirming his worst fears. From the look on his face, she could tell he was absolutely terrified and probably trying to find a way to avoid the whole thing. To help him grasp the situation faster, Hemis casually added that she could help him get stronger so he could face his opponent more easily, just like she had done for Kurken. That little comment worked like a charm. Hyunsuk immediately bowed down, accepting the fight on the spot. He thanked her for her generous offer to help, but stubbornly declared that he wanted to do it all on his own. Back in the present, Rachel and Bobo had finally pieced together why Hyunsuk looked so crushed and hopeless. Rachel, however, didn't feel the slightest bit sorry for him. Instead, she immediately started mocking him. She first turned to Bobo and told him to say goodbye to his master, then looked straight at Hyunsuk and told him to accept his fate and just die already. To drive the point home, she reminded him of the harsh reality. He was going to fight someone with over 50,000 battle power, while his own was barely scraping 9,000. This was something Hyunsuk was painfully aware of, but Rachel brought it up anyway. She wasn't trying to be helpful, she just wanted to get back at him for what he said to her an hour ago. After getting her revenge, Rachel tried to act a bit more reasonable. She pointed out another fact. In her opinion, Hyunsuk had grown a lot in the past few days, but even so, it still seemed impossible for him to face someone nearly 5 times stronger than him. Hyunsuk, who had calmed down a little by now, began brainstorming ways to survive this challenge. He knew he had to get stronger, but reaching that level in just a month felt completely out of reach. For a brief moment, he couldn't help but wish how amazing it would be if Bobo could fight in his place. At least they were on a similar level, and Bobo would have a 50% chance of winning. But Rachel, ever eager to crush his dreams, reminded him that the fight was supposed to be a duel, so no one else could step in for him. At first, Hyunsuk nodded in agreement without much thought, but then something clicked in his mind and he paused, as if an idea had just popped into his brain, probably something ridiculous knowing him. With a sly grin creeping onto his face, Hyunsuk asked Rachel if she remembered exactly what Hemis had said about the fight. Rachel furrowed her brow in thought before replying. She said, "You have 1 month to defeat the battalion commander. That's it." Hyunsuk's expression completely changed. His mood lightened and he suddenly turned and started walking away, his steps quicker and more confident, realizing he didn't necessarily have to face his opponent directly after a month. A cunning plan was clearly forming in his mind. Hyunsuk figured that if there wasn't going to be a direct fight, he could use some Bobo, a few weapons, or even poison to take down the battalion commander during the next month. The best plan that came to his mind was to lure the commander out of his safe spot and ambush him with Bobo. It wasn't exactly the easiest plan, but it felt like the only option. That made Rachel wonder if Hyunsuk was a coward or just a really clever guy. Soon enough, she learned how Hyunsuk planned to lure the commander out. It also reminded her of another frustrating fact. In her opinion, someone as sloppy as Hyunsuk probably didn't stand much of a chance at convincing a battalion commander to do anything. But, unlike what Rachel thought, this time Hyunsuk actually knew what he was doing. Hyunsuk mentioned that he had already met the commander before and described him as a fat pig who only cared about eating fancy food. Rachel figured he was probably talking about Doras, the same Doras who had generously handed him 201 of his soldiers. Minutes, or maybe hours later, Hyunsuk started working on his plan to win Doras's trust. For this plan, he decided to make a delicious dish, and here's how he prepared it. First, he soaked the Uran's short ribs in water mixed with honey to get rid of all the blood. Once the blood was completely drained, he put the meat in a pot and gave it a quick boil. While the meat was boiling, he started chopping the mushrooms and green onions. After that, he added water, sugar, soy sauce, and of course garlic, then mixed everything together smoothly. Once he was done prepping, he added it all to the meat and let it simmer slowly. The only thing left to do was wait for at least 30 minutes for the food to be ready. To kill some time, Hyunsuk decided to play with Bobo, but things didn't go as he expected and ended up being pretty embarrassing for him. If it hadn't been for Rachel, he might have completely forgotten about his food, but thankfully, that didn't happen. When he checked, the dish was perfectly cooked, soft and tender. The only thing left was to plate it nicely, and Hyunsuk did it carefully and with pride. To give it an extra touch, he sprinkled some finely chopped green onions on top to make it smell even better. Finally, the food, and the key to winning the battalion commander's heart and trust, was ready.